Chapter 1. The Weight of Leadership. There's a moment on day 62 that I keep coming back to. Not the walkers at the camp's perimeter. Not the dwindling supplies. Something quieter. Shane Walsh stands at the edge of the Atlanta survivor camp, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The gesture has become routine by now, but there's something different in the way he stares at the timepiece, like he's counting down to something that's never going to come. 3 days. It's been 3 days since Rick Grimes should have found them, should have walked into their camp with that bewildered expression and that moral certainty that always seemed to complicate Shane's decisions. But the hospital yielded nothing but empty beds, and the echo of Shane's voice calling his partner's name down abandoned hallways. The empty hospital bed becomes our motif here. Not just the physical absence of Rick Grimes lying unconscious in King County General, but what that emptiness represents. It's the space where moral complexity should have taken root, where Shane's practical decisions would have been questioned, refined, held up against a different kind of strength. Instead, there's just silence, and Shane's word carries the weight of absolute authority because there's no one left to challenge it. Glenn Rhee shifts nervously beside the RV, adjusting the straps of his supply pack for what might be the 5th time in 10 minutes. He's been the group's lifeline to the city, slipping through walker hordes with an almost supernatural ability to remain unseen. But today there's something hesitant in his movements. His eyes keep drifting toward Shane, then away, like he's building up the courage to say something he's not sure he should. "Shane," Glenn finally says, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to suggest something they know won't be well received. "Maybe we should check the hospital again. I mean, there were other floors, other wings. If your partner was there when the bombs fell..." Shane's response is immediate, final. "Already checked everywhere that matters, Glenn. Spent 2 hours in that place, looking for someone who wasn't there." He doesn't mention the way the silence echoed through those corridors, or how he'd stood in front of an empty bed, reading a chart that confirmed Rick Grimes had been there, had been alive, had simply vanished into the chaos of the early outbreak. Instead, he clips his radio to his belt and signals to the group that it's time to move. "We stick to the plan. Medical supplies first, then ammunition. We're not wasting time on dead ends." Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about this moment. Shane's dismissal of the hospital isn't just about Rick anymore. It's about establishing that there are certain discussions the group will not be having, certain hopes they will not be entertaining. In another timeline, Rick would have arrived 3 days ago and immediately begun asking questions about the wisdom of living this close to Atlanta, about the sustainability of their current setup, about whether they were thinking long-term or just surviving day to day. But without Rick's voice in the conversation, Shane's practical assessments carry a weight they were never meant to bear alone. Laurie Grimes watches this exchange from her position near the laundry line, Carl pressed close to her side as he reads one of the few comic books they managed to salvage from their hasty evacuation of King County. There's something in her expression that's worth sitting with. Not grief exactly, because they still don't know what happened to Rick, but a recognition that something fundamental has shifted in how decisions get made around here. When Shane says the hospital is a dead end, that's not a tactical assessment up for debate. That's the final word, and everyone knows it. Carl looks up from his comic book, his eyes tracking between his mother and Shane, with the kind of awareness that children develop when they're trying to understand adult tensions they're not quite ready to process. "Mum, are we going to keep looking for Dad?" The question hangs in the air for a moment longer than it should. Laurie's eyes find Shane's across the camp, and there's something in that look that carries its own weight. Not accusation, but a question she's not ready to ask out loud. Shane's attention to her has become more obvious in the past few days, more protective, more personal. Without Rick as a constant presence, the boundaries that kept Shane's feelings carefully managed have started to blur. "We'll keep looking, baby," Laurie says finally, but her voice carries the careful tone of someone who's not entirely sure she believes what she's saying. Shane and his team are checking everywhere. We just have to be patient. Shane overhears this exchange and approaches with that purposeful stride that's become familiar to everyone in the camp. He crouches down to Carl's eye level, his expression softening in a way that's genuine but also calculated. "Hey, buddy, you know we're doing everything we can, right? Your dad would want us to keep everyone safe first. That's what cops do. We protect people." What Shane doesn't say, what he's been careful not to articulate even to himself, is that Rick's absence has simplified his world in ways that should probably concern him more than they do. Without Rick's moral voice asking whether they're making the right choice or just the expedient one, Shane's tactical training can operate without interference. Keep people alive, maintain group cohesion, secure resources. Simple objectives with simple solutions, unencumbered by the kind of ethical wrestling that Rick would have brought to every decision. Carol Pelletier observes this interaction from her position folding clothes near the water basin. She's developed a quiet awareness of group dynamics in the week since the outbreak, the kind of hypervigilance that comes from years of reading the emotional weather in dangerous situations. Ed's death in the early Walker attack left her more observant of how power operates within the group, and what she's noticing about Shane's leadership style is worth naming clearly. There's no deliberation anymore, no gathering of voices, no careful weighing of options. When Shane makes a decision, the conversation is over. It's efficient, certainly. It's kept them alive through several close calls. But Carol recognizes the pattern from her marriage. Authority that doesn't invite questions tends to grow more comfortable with itself over time. And Shane's authority is growing more comfortable with itself every day. Dale Horvath emerges from the RV with his fishing hat askew and a concerned expression that's become increasingly familiar. At 70, he's the closest thing the group has to a voice of experience, but his concerns about Shane's leadership style have been met with polite but firm dismissal. Today, watching Shane organize the supply run with military precision and zero input from the group, Dale's worry lines deepen. "Shane," Dale says, approaching with the kind of careful respect that older men use when they're trying to offer advice to someone who probably won't want to hear it. "Maybe we should talk about establishing some kind of decision-making process. Get everyone's input on these supply runs." Shane's response is immediate and final. "Dale, I appreciate the concern, but we don't have time for committees right now. People need medical supplies. We know where to get them. We go in, we get them, we come back. Simple as that." The dismissal is polite but absolute. Dale nods, but there's something in his eyes that suggests this conversation isn't over, just postponed. He's lived long enough to recognize when authority becomes less interested in wisdom and more interested in control. The problem is, Shane's control has been keeping them alive, which makes it difficult to argue against without sounding like he's arguing against survival itself. This is where the pattern starts to click, or at least it might. Without Rick's moral compass creating tension between what's effective and what's right, Shane's leadership has evolved into something that prioritizes immediate survival above all other considerations. It's not that Shane is wrong about what needs to be done. His tactical assessments are sound, his protective instincts are genuine, and his commitment to keeping the group alive is absolute. But something is missing from the equation, something that Rick would have provided without even realizing it. The empty hospital bed represents more than just Rick's absence. It represents the absence of a voice that would have asked the harder questions. Not whether Shane's decisions work, but whether they're sustainable. Not whether they keep people alive in the short term, but whether they preserve what makes those people worth keeping alive in the long term. As the supply team prepares to head into Atlanta, Glenn takes one last look back toward the direction of King County General Hospital. The gesture is unconscious, automatic, the way people check for something they know isn't going to be there. But Shane notices everything, and his jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. "Glenn," Shane says, his voice carrying a note of finality that the younger man recognizes immediately. Eyes forward, we're not looking backward anymore. And that, perhaps, is the moment when Shane's unchallenged authority becomes something more than temporary leadership. That's the moment when the group stops waiting for Rick Grimes to walk into their camp and starts accepting that Shane Walsh's word is the only word that matters. The empty hospital bed isn't just about Rick's absence anymore. It's about the kind of leadership the group will learn to live with, and what they'll lose in the process of learning to survive under it. The weight of leadership, it turns out, is heavier when there's no one to help you carry it, and Shane Walsh is about to discover exactly what that weight does to a person when they carry it alone. Chapter 2. The CDC Revelation. There's a moment at the CDC on day 64 that I find worth examining closely. Not the moment when the doors first open, not the relief of finding hot water and electric lights. Something more unsettling. Dr. Edwin Jenner sits across from the group in that sterile cafeteria, his hands folded with the careful precision of someone who's rehearsed this conversation in his mind more times than he cares to count. He's about to deliver information that would have broken Rick Grimes' worldview into pieces. Information that would have sent Rick into days of moral wrestling about what it means to be human in a world where humanity itself has been redefined. But Rick isn't here to receive this revelation. Shane Walsh is, and Shane's response is going to reshape everything the group thinks they know about survival. The empty hospital bed appears again here as our motif. But now it represents something different. Not just Rick's physical absence, but the absence of the kind of mind that would struggle with Dr. Jenner's revelation instead of simply processing it as tactical intelligence. The bed that should have held someone who would agonize over what it means that everyone carries the virus, what it means that death is no longer the end of individual existence. Instead, we have Shane, whose tactical training has prepared him to accept harsh realities without the luxury of extended moral contemplation. "We're all infected, Doctor," Jenner says, his voice carrying the weight of someone who's been alone with this truth for longer than any human mind should have to bear. The virus is in all of us. When we die, from any cause except for severe trauma to the brainstem, we come back. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about Shane's reaction. There's no visible shock, no existential crisis, no desperate questions about what this means for their humanity or their hopes for the future. Shane processes the information the way he processes all tactical intelligence. He absorbs it, categorizes it as relevant survival data, and immediately begins calculating how this knowledge changes their operational parameters. His first question isn't philosophical or emotional. It's practical. "How long?" Shane asks. "From death to reanimation, how much time do we have?" "Doctor," Jenner blinks, clearly expecting a different kind of response. "Varies by individual. Anywhere from 3 minutes to 8 hours. The longest recorded case was 8 hours and 14 minutes. Shane nods, filing away the timeline like he's memorizing the effective range of a weapon. And there's no cure, no treatment, no way to stop it. None, Jenna confirms. Then we adapt, Shane says simply. Everyone needs to know this. Everyone needs to understand that when someone dies, they become a threat. Period. The simplicity of Shane's acceptance creates a silence in the room that's worth sitting with. Dale's hands shake slightly as he reaches for his water glass. Carol's face has gone pale, but her eyes remain fixed on Shane, watching him process information that should have destroyed something fundamental about his worldview. Laurie stares at Shane with an expression that's becoming increasingly familiar, a look that says she's recognizing something about the man she thought she knew. In another timeline, Rick would have spent the next several hours asking Dr. Jenner questions about the soul, about consciousness, about what it means to be human if everyone carries the seeds of their own monstrous transformation. He would have wrestled with the theological implications, the moral weight of killing someone who might reanimate, the question of whether they were still fighting to preserve humanity or just postponing its inevitable end. But Shane doesn't ask those questions because Shane doesn't think in those terms. For Shane, this is simply new intelligence about the operational environment, and the operational environment has been hostile from the beginning. Dale finally breaks the silence, his voice carrying the tremor of someone whose fundamental assumptions about existence have just been shattered. Shane, this changes everything. What Dr. Jenner is telling us it means. It means we've been thinking about death wrong, Shane interrupts, his tone matter of fact. We thought dead meant safe. Now we know dead means dangerous until we make sure it's really dead. That's all. Carol watches this exchange with the kind of hyper-awareness she's developed since Ed's death. She recognizes the way Shane compartmentalizes information that should be overwhelming, the way he reduces complex emotional realities to simple tactical adjustments. It's efficient, certainly. It's probably what's going to keep them alive. But Carol has lived with someone who treated emotional complexity as operational inefficiency, and she knows what that kind of thinking costs over time. Laurie's growing concern becomes impossible to ignore in this moment. Carl sits beside her, trying to process Dr. Jenner's revelation through the limited framework of a child's understanding, and she watches Shane explain to her son that death is just another kind of danger to prepare for. No comfort, no acknowledgement of the horror of what they've just learned, no recognition that an 8-year-old might need something more than tactical adjustments to process the fact that everyone he loves carries the virus that will eventually turn them into the monsters they've been running from. Carl, Shane says, crouching down to the boy's eye level, this is why we practice safety protocols. This is why we always secure an area before we sleep. Your dad would want you to understand that being smart about danger is how we stay alive. The reference to Rick is casual, automatic, but it carries a weight that Shane doesn't seem to recognize. He's invoking Rick's memory to justify an approach to survival that Rick would have fundamentally disagreed with. Rick would have wanted Carl to understand the tactical realities, certainly, but he also would have wanted his son to wrestle with the moral implications, to maintain some connection to the idea that individual human lives matter beyond their tactical value. Shane's version of what Rick would want is filtered through Shane's own survival philosophy, and Laurie is beginning to understand that the two approaches are not compatible. Glenn shifts uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between Shane and Dr. Jenner. So when we lose someone, he says quietly, when someone in our group dies, we have to put them down, Shane says without hesitation. Clean, quick, decisive, before they become a threat to everyone else. The clinical terminology is deliberate. Not kill, not end their suffering, not even stop them from turning. Put them down. The language of tactical necessity, devoid of the emotional weight that should accompany the idea of destroying someone you've traveled with, survived with, cared about. Shane's ability to separate operational requirements from emotional consequences is exactly what makes him effective as a leader in crisis situations, and exactly what makes him dangerous as a leader in the long term. Dr. Jenner has been watching this interaction with growing fascination and concern. He's clearly expected a different kind of response to his revelation, the kind of response that Rick would have provided. Questions about meaning, about hope, about whether there's any point in fighting to preserve a humanity that's already been fundamentally compromised. Instead, he's watching Shane turn his worst nightmare into a training manual. You understand, Doctor, Jenner says slowly, that this means everyone you love, everyone in this room, will eventually become one of those things out there. Unless they die from severe head trauma, they will reanimate. Shane's response is immediate and unqualified. Then we make sure when our time comes, someone does what needs to be done. Clean and quick. No exceptions. The matter-of-fact way Shane discusses his own eventual death and reanimation creates another silence in the room. Dale removes his fishing hat and runs his hands through his hair, struggling to process the casual way Shane has just suggested they all agree to kill each other when the time comes. Andrea stares at her hands, probably thinking about Amy, probably wondering if she'll be able to do what Shane is describing if someone she loves gets bitten. But Shane has already moved past the emotional implications and started thinking about implementation. We need protocols, Shane continues. Everyone needs to know that if they get bit, if they get scratched, they tell someone immediately. No hiding it, no hoping it'll be fine. And everyone needs to understand that putting down the infected isn't murder, it's prevention. Here's what makes this moment genuinely chilling. Shane isn't wrong about the tactical necessities. Everything he's saying is probably correct from a survival standpoint. The group will need protocols for dealing with bites and scratches. They will need to be prepared to kill the recently deceased before they reanimate. They will need to accept that death is no longer a private tragedy, but a group security issue. But the speed with which Shane reduces these moral complexities to operational procedures reveals something about his leadership philosophy that should probably concern the group more than it seems to. The empty hospital bed represents what's missing from this conversation. Rick would have asked the harder questions, not just how to implement new security protocols, but whether they were still fighting to preserve something worth preserving. Not just how to kill the infected efficiently, but how to maintain their humanity while doing what survival requires. Not just how to adapt to the new reality, but how to ensure that adaptation doesn't cost them everything that made them worth saving in the first place. Carol notices something else in this moment, something that connects to her growing awareness of how authority operates within the group. Shane hasn't asked for anyone's input on these protocols. He hasn't suggested they discuss the moral implications or consider alternative approaches. He's simply announced how things will work going forward, and he's done it with the confident assumption that his word on the subject is final. The virus revelation hasn't just changed their understanding of death. It's given Shane another justification for unquestioned authority, another reason why the group can't afford the luxury of democratic decision-making. when Dr. Jenner finally offers to let them stay at the CDC, to live out their remaining time in comfort until the generator runs out and the building's security systems fail. Shane's response is swift and decisive. "We leave in the morning," he says, cutting off any debate before it can begin. "This place is a tomb. We don't wait around to die." And there it is. The fundamental difference between Shane's approach and the approach Rick would have taken. Rick would have agonized over the choice, would have considered the arguments for staying, would have wrestled with the question of whether fighting for survival is always worth the cost. Shane sees a tactical situation with a clear, optimal solution, implements it, and moves on. No moral wrestling, no extended contemplation of alternatives, no recognition that choosing to keep fighting in a world where everyone's infected might require a different kind of justification than simple survival instinct. The group leaves the CDC on day 65 with new knowledge and new protocols, led by a man who's proven he can process the worst possible truths and convert them into actionable intelligence. It should feel like victory, like strength, like the kind of leadership that will keep them alive. Instead, it feels like something essential has been lost in translation, something that the empty hospital bed was supposed to provide but never can. Chapter 3. The Farm Arrival. There's a sound on day 67 that changes everything, though at first it seems like just another crisis the group will navigate together. The crack of Otis's hunting rifle echoes across Herschel Green's property, followed by Carl Grimes's scream as the bullet meant for a deer tears through his small body instead. But what happens in the hours that follow reveals something about Shane Walsh's approach to crisis management that the group hasn't fully understood until now. In another timeline, Rick would have been there to wrestle with the moral implications of what survival requires when a child's life hangs in the balance. But Shane approaches the crisis with the same tactical clarity he's brought to every challenge since the outbreak began, and the results are going to haunt the group in ways they don't yet comprehend. The empty hospital bed surfaces again here as our motif, but now it represents something even more unsettling. It's the absence of the kind of moral wrestling that would have occurred if Rick had been the one accompanying Otis to retrieve medical supplies from the FEMA trailer, the bed that should have held someone who would struggle with the choice between Carl's life and Otis's life, someone who would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his days. Instead, we have Shane, whose approach to impossible choices has been refined by years of tactical training and months of unquestioned leadership authority. Shane returns to Herschel's farmhouse at 3:17 a.m. on day 68, alone, carrying the medical supplies that will save Carl's life. His explanation to the group is delivered with the same matter-of-fact precision he's used to describe every tactical decision since the CDC. Otis didn't make it. Walkers got him while Shane was securing the supplies. Quick, clean, unavoidable. Shane's account includes the necessary details about the young man's bravery and sacrifice, but there's something missing from his delivery that Laurie notices immediately. There's no weight to it, no sense that Shane is carrying the burden of watching someone die for Carl's sake. Here's what I find genuinely worth examining about this moment. Shane's clinical description of Otis's death isn't necessarily dishonest, but it's strategically incomplete. He doesn't mention the choice he made when the walkers closed in, the calculation that led him to use Otis's injury to buy himself the time needed to escape with the medical supplies. He doesn't mention the sound Otis made when Shane's tactical decision became clear, or the way Shane had to compartmentalize that sound to maintain focus on his primary objective, keeping Carl alive. But perhaps most importantly, Shane doesn't mention that he feels no guilt about the choice he made. That's the detail that would have distinguished this moment from Rick's version of the same crisis. Rick would have saved Carl and carried Otis's death as a wound that never fully healed. Shane saved Carl and filed Otis's death under acceptable losses incurred during successful mission completion. Herschel Green receives the news of Otis's death with the kind of quiet devastation that comes from losing someone who represented the best of what his community stood for. But his grief is complicated by his growing awareness that Shane Walsh operates according to survival mathematics that don't account for what Herschel considers the essential humanity of each individual life. When Herschel asks Shane to tell him about Otis's final moments, Shane's response is brief, respectful, and devoid of the emotional complexity that the question deserves. "He died protecting Carl," Shane says simply. "That's what matters." Carol observes this exchange with the hypervigilance she's developed since Ed's death, and what she notices is worth sitting with. Shane's ability to reduce complex emotional realities to simple tactical outcomes isn't just a leadership style, it's a worldview. For Shane, Otis's death isn't a tragedy that happened while saving Carl. It's a successful mission outcome that cost one asset to preserve another. The distinction matters because it reveals how Shane categorizes the people under his protection as assets to be deployed, preserved, or sacrificed according to operational requirements. On day 69, Glenn makes the discovery that will test Shane's leadership philosophy in ways the young man couldn't have anticipated. The barn on Herschel's property contains 17 walkers, including Herschel's wife and stepson, maintained by a man who still believes that what they're facing is a kind of sickness that might someday be cured. In another timeline, Rick would have spent hours talking with Herschel about faith and hope and the possibility of redemption. He would have wrestled with the question of whether respecting Herschel's beliefs was more important than ensuring the group's immediate security. But Shane's response to the barn walkers is swift, tactical, and absolute. "Those things are a threat," Shane tells Glenn before the younger man has even finished explaining what he found. "They get dealt with. Today." Glenn's eyes widen as he realizes Shane intends to clear the barn without Herschel's permission, without group consultation, without any consideration of the farm owner's beliefs about what those walkers represent. "Shane, maybe we should talk to Herschel first. They're his family. His wife is in there." Shane's response is immediate and final. "His wife is dead, Glenn. What's in that barn is a weapon pointed at everyone on this property. We don't negotiate with weapons." Here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Shane doesn't frame this as a difficult decision that requires careful consideration of competing values. He doesn't acknowledge that Herschel's beliefs might deserve respect, or that the group might benefit from finding a diplomatic solution that preserves their relationship with their host. For Shane, the tactical assessment is complete. The barn contains threats, threats get eliminated, and anyone who objects to that operational necessity is allowing sentiment to compromise group security. Dale attempts to intervene when he learns about Shane's plan to clear the barn, but his appeal to Shane's sense of respect for Herschel's property and beliefs falls on deaf ears. "Shane, this is Herschel's home. These are his family members. We can't just—" "We can and we will," Shane interrupts. "This isn't a democracy, Dale. It's a survival situation. I make the calls that keep people alive." The dismissal is polite, but absolute, and it reveals something about Shane's leadership philosophy that should concern the group more than it seems to. Shane hasn't just rejected Dale's input on this decision, he's rejected the idea that Dale's input is relevant to this kind of decision. The group's safety, as Shane defines it, takes precedence over every other consideration, including the moral and diplomatic complexities that older, more experienced voices might bring to the discussion. On day 70, one day earlier than the same events would have unfolded in another timeline, Shane organizes the barn clearing with military efficiency. He assigns positions, distributes weapons, and provides clear rules of engagement. When Herschel emerges from the farmhouse and sees Shane's team preparing to destroy what he considers his family, the confrontation is brief and decisive. "You can't do this," Herschel says, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his home and his beliefs. "Those are people, sick people who need our help." Shane's response is respectful in tone, but uncompromising in content. "Dr. Green, I understand your position, but my job is to keep my people alive. Those things in there are a threat to that mission. I'm sorry." The apology is genuine but tactical. Shane isn't sorry about the decision itself. He's sorry that the decision conflicts with Herschel's emotional needs. But emotional needs, in Shane's operational framework, are secondary to security requirements. The barn doors open, and 17 walkers stumble into the Georgia sunlight, to be systematically eliminated by Shane's team. What follows is the moment that will haunt Carol Pelletier for the rest of her life. Sophia emerges from the barn, her small form transformed by death and reanimation into one of the threats Shane has trained the group to eliminate without hesitation. In another timeline, Rick would have struggled with the shot, would have hesitated long enough for Sophia's mother to process what she was seeing, would have made the final moment about saying goodbye to a child they all loved. But Shane's training has eliminated that kind of hesitation from his decision-making process. The shot is clean, quick, professional. Sophia drops to the ground before Carol fully processes that her daughter has been found and lost in the same instant. Shane's immediate focus shifts to perimeter security, ensuring that the noise hasn't attracted additional walkers, coordinating the cleanup of 17 bodies, organizing the group's withdrawal from a location that's now been compromised by conflict with their host. He approaches Carol's grief as he approaches every crisis, as an operational complication that requires management until it stops interfering with mission objectives. "I'm sorry for your loss," Shane tells Carol, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. "Sophia was a good kid. She didn't deserve what happened to her." But what Carol hears in Shane's condolences is the same tactical efficiency that characterized his approach to Otis's death. Sophia's death is acknowledged, processed, and filed under unavoidable casualties incurred during successful mission completion. There's no recognition that finding Sophia as a walker might require a different kind of response than simply eliminating her as a security threat. No acknowledgement that Carol might need time to grieve before being expected to function as an effective team member again. The empty hospital bed represents all the emotional complexity that Shane's leadership philosophy has streamlined out of their survival strategy. Rick would have understood that Sophia's death required something more than tactical efficiency. He would have recognized that Carol's grief was more than an operational complication, that Herschel's beliefs deserved more consideration than a polite apology, that the barn clearing represented a moral choice as much as a security necessity. But Shane's approach has been effective. Carl is alive because Shane was willing to make the hard choice about Otis's life. The group is safer because Shane eliminated the barn walkers before they could escape and threaten the living. The farm is secure because Shane prioritized operational requirements over diplomatic niceties. Every decision Shane has made since taking command has contributed to the group's survival, and his authority has grown stronger with each successful crisis resolution. What the group is beginning to understand, though they haven't articulated it yet, is that Shane's version of survival comes with costs that extend beyond the tactical. Carol's grief is real and deep and complicated, but it's also inconvenient for a group leader whose job is to maintain morale and operational readiness. Herschel's faith has been shattered not just by the revelation that his family members were beyond saving, but by the clinical efficiency with which that revelation was delivered. The barn clearing was successful from a security standpoint, but it's created diplomatic and emotional complications that will resonate through every decision the group makes going forward. And Shane, for his part, doesn't see those complications as problems to be solved. He sees them as the unavoidable costs of keeping people alive in a world that doesn't offer clean solutions to moral dilemmas. His tactical training has taught him that the mission comes first, and the mission has been accomplished. Everything else is operational aftermath, to be managed as efficiently as possible until the next crisis demands his attention. The farm that was supposed to offer refuge has become another battlefield, and Shane Walsh has won it with the same ruthless efficiency he's brought to every challenge since the outbreak began. But Carol Pelletier stares at the spot where her daughter fell, and she's beginning to understand what victory looks like when it's purchased with that kind of tactical clarity. Chapter 4. The Schism. There's a conversation on day 72 that happens just after sunrise, when the Georgia humidity hangs thick over Herschel's farm, and most of the group is still processing the aftermath of what they witnessed at the barn 2 days earlier. Dale Horvath approaches Shane Walsh with the careful, measured steps of someone who's spent 70 years learning how to have difficult conversations with men who don't particularly want to hear what he has to say. What follows is the first direct challenge to Shane's leadership authority since the outbreak began, and Shane's response is going to reveal something about his approach to dissent that the group hasn't fully understood until now. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents the absence of a mediating voice that might have helped navigate the growing tensions within the group. The bed that should have held someone capable of bridging the gap between Dale's moral concerns and Shane's tactical certainties, someone who could have found a middle ground that preserved both the group's security and their cohesion. Instead, we have a direct confrontation between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews, with no one present who has the authority to synthesize them into something the group can live with. Shane, Dale says, removing his fishing hat in a gesture that signals the seriousness of what he's about to discuss. We need to talk about what happened with Sophia, about how you handled that situation. Shane's response is immediate and controlled, the kind of measured reaction that comes from tactical training and months of unquestioned authority. What about it, Dale? Carol's daughter was infected. I did what needed to be done to keep everyone safe. But Dale has lived long enough to recognize when someone is using operational language to avoid emotional accountability. That little girl deserved better than a bullet from someone who didn't even pause to consider what Carol was going through. Sophia wasn't just a threat, Shane. She was a child. Here's what I find genuinely unsettling about Shane's response to Dale's moral challenge. There's no anger, no defensive justification, no acknowledgement that the criticism might have merit. Shane processes Dale's objection the same way he processes all challenges to his operational decisions, as evidence that the challenger doesn't understand the tactical realities they're facing, and therefore lacks the standing to criticize his choices. Dale, Shane says, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, I understand you're upset. But emotional decisions get people killed in this world. Carol's feelings don't change the fact that her daughter was a walker. My job is to eliminate threats, before they eliminate us. That's all. The dismissal is polite but absolute, and it reveals something about Shane's leadership philosophy that should concern the group more than it seems to. Shane hasn't just rejected Dale's criticism, he's rejected the idea that moral considerations have any legitimate role in his decision-making process. For Shane, Dale's concerns about Sophia's humanity are not competing values to be balanced against security requirements. They're operational distractions that compromise effective leadership. But Dale has been watching Shane's evolution as a leader since the outbreak began, and what he's observing is the gradual elimination of everything that might complicate or slow down Shane's tactical responses. Shane, I've been around long enough to know the difference between leadership and control. What you're doing, the way you're making these decisions without consulting anyone, without considering the human cost of your choices, that's not leadership. That's something else. Shane's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly, a physical tell that suggests Dale has touched on something Shane himself hasn't fully examined. What would you call it, Dale? I'd call it dangerous, Dale says quietly. Not dangerous to the walkers, dangerous to us, to who we are, to what we're trying to preserve. The conversation ends with Shane walking away, but the seeds of division have been planted in soil that's already been prepared by weeks of growing unease about Shane's increasingly authoritarian approach to group management. Dale's challenge hasn't changed Shane's mind about anything, but it has forced other members of the group to confront questions they've been avoiding about the kind of leader they're following and the kind of people they're becoming under his direction. Laurie Grimes faces her own moment of reckoning that same afternoon when she watches Shane teaching Carl how to handle a pistol with the same clinical efficiency he brings to every aspect of survival training. There's nothing objectively wrong with the lesson. Carl needs to know how to protect himself in this new world. But there's something in the way Shane teaches that reveals his fundamental approach to childhood in the post-outbreak era. Remember, Carl, Shane says, adjusting the boy's grip on the weapon. When you're in a threatening situation, you don't think, you react. Hesitation gets you killed. When something needs to be dealt with, you deal with it. Clean and quick. Laurie recognizes the language Shane used to describe Sophia's death, and she realizes he's teaching her 8-year-old son to think about violence the same way Shane thinks about it, as a tactical necessity that doesn't require emotional processing or moral consideration. In another timeline, Rick would have approached Carl's weapons training with acknowledgement of the weight that comes with taking a life, even the life of a walker. But Shane's version of survival education eliminates that kind of complexity as operational inefficiency. Shane, Laurie says, approaching with the careful tone of someone who's about to challenge a man whose authority has become absolute. Can I talk to you for a minute? About Carl's training? Shane's response carries the slight irritation of someone whose expertise is being questioned by someone he considers less qualified to assess tactical necessities. What about it, Laurie? The boy needs to know how to defend himself. He's 8 years old, Laurie says, her voice carrying the strain of trying to balance her concerns about Carl's psychological development with her recognition that Shane's protection has kept them alive. He needs to understand that taking a life, even a walker's life, should mean something, that it should be hard. Shane's expression shifts to something that's almost sympathetic, but there's an underlying condescension that Laurie recognizes from conversations she's had with men who think emotional considerations are luxuries the world can't afford. Laurie, I understand you want to protect Carl's innocence, but innocence is a luxury we can't afford anymore. The world changed. We have to change with it. Here's what makes this conversation particularly significant. Shane isn't wrong about the practical necessities of Carl's education. An 8-year-old boy in a world full of walking corpses does need to know how to use a weapon effectively, without hesitation, in life-or-death situations. But Shane's approach to that education eliminates everything that might preserve Carl's humanity in the process of ensuring his survival. There's no discussion of when violence is justified, no acknowledgement that killing should be difficult even when it's necessary, no recognition that how Carl learns to think about violence will shape the kind of person he becomes. And Laurie is beginning to understand that Shane's vision of Carl's future is fundamentally incompatible with her own. Shane is training Carl to be a perfect soldier in a war that will never end, someone who can make life-and-death decisions without the burden of moral complexity. Laurie still hopes Carl can learn to survive while retaining some connection to the idea that individual lives matter, that violence should be a last resort, that being human means carrying the weight of the choices survival requires. The romantic tension between Shane and Laurie, freed from the barrier of Rick's presence, creates another layer of complexity that the group hasn't had to navigate before. Shane's feelings for Laurie have been obvious since the early days of the outbreak, but Rick's expected return kept those feelings carefully controlled. Now, with Rick's fate uncertain and Shane's authority unquestioned, the careful boundaries that kept their relationship appropriate have started to blur in ways that affect the group's entire dynamic. But it's Daryl Dixon's growing dissatisfaction with Shane's leadership that represents the most significant threat to group cohesion. Daryl has been Shane's most effective lieutenant, his hunting skills and survival instincts making him invaluable to the group's security. But his observation of how Shane handled Carol's grief after Sophia's death has created fractures in his loyalty that Shane hasn't recognized. Daryl finds Carol sitting alone near the farmhouse on the evening of day 73, staring at the spot where Sophia fell 2 days earlier. Her grief is quiet, contained, the kind of sorrow that comes from years of learning not to express pain in ways that might create problems for other people. But Daryl recognizes the signs of someone whose emotional needs have been categorized as operational complications, and his growing anger about Shane's treatment of Carol's loss is starting to outweigh his respect for Shane's tactical effectiveness. "You don't have to sit out here by yourself," Daryl says, settling beside Carol with the awkward gentleness of someone who's not used to offering comfort, but recognizes when it's needed. Carol looks up at him with eyes that carry an exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue. Shane says we need to focus on moving forward. That dwelling on what we've lost doesn't help anyone. Shane says a lot of things, Daryl replies, and there's something in his voice that suggests his faith in Shane's wisdom is no longer absolute. Don't mean he's right about everything. This moment represents the first crack in what appeared to be Shane's unshakable coalition. Daryl's loyalty was based on respect for Shane's effectiveness and his commitment to keeping the group alive. But Shane's inability to recognize that Carol's grief deserved more than tactical management has created doubts about whether Shane's version of leadership preserves anything worth saving about human community. Herschel Green's patience with Shane's disrespect for his home and beliefs reaches its breaking point on day 74, 2 days earlier than the same confrontation would have occurred in another timeline. The barn incident wasn't just about eliminating walkers. It was about Shane's complete dismissal of Herschel's authority on his own property, his refusal to consider diplomatic solutions that might have preserved their relationship with their host, his clinical efficiency in destroying what Herschel considered his family. "Mr. Walsh," Herschel says, approaching Shane with the formal politeness that Southern men use when they're about to deliver an ultimatum. "I think it's time for your group to move on. This arrangement isn't working out the way I'd hoped." Shane's response is respectful in tone, but reveals his fundamental inability to understand why Herschel might be upset about having his beliefs and his authority challenged. "Dr. Green, I understand you're upset about the barn, but I did what needed to be done to keep everyone safe. That includes your family." "You didn't do what needed to be done," Herschel says, his voice carrying the quiet anger of a man whose hospitality has been repaid with humiliation. "You did what you wanted to do, when you wanted to do it, without any consideration for my feelings or my beliefs. That's not leadership, Mr. Walsh. That's occupation." The word hangs in the air between them, and Shane's expression shifts to something that suggests he's genuinely surprised by Herschel's characterization of his actions. For Shane, the barn clearing was obviously necessary, obviously correct, obviously the only rational response to the security threat those walkers represented. The idea that his operational decisions might be perceived as disrespectful or authoritarian hasn't occurred to him because he's been operating under the assumption that effective leadership justifies whatever methods prove successful. But perhaps the most revealing development is Andrea's unexpected support for Shane's leadership style, creating a division among the group's women that complicates any potential resistance to Shane's authority. Andrea has watched Shane make difficult decisions quickly and effectively, without the kind of moral wrestling that might have paralyzed a different leader, and she's concluded that his approach represents the kind of strength the group needs to survive. "Dale, I don't understand what you're upset about," Andrea tells him, during one of their increasingly frequent arguments about Shane's leadership. "Shane saved Carl's life. Shane eliminated the walkers in Herschel's barn before they could escape and threaten everyone. Shane has kept us alive when other groups have fallen apart or died. What exactly is the problem?" Dale's response carries the frustration of someone trying to explain something that should be obvious, but isn't. "The problem, Andrea, is that Shane's version of keeping us alive is costing us everything that makes being alive worthwhile. We're becoming something that Rick wouldn't recognize." "Rick isn't here," Andrea says bluntly. "Shane is, and Shane's methods work." The division between Andrea and Dale reflects a larger philosophical split that's developing within the group, between those who prioritize immediate survival above all other considerations, and those who believe that how they survive matters as much as whether they survive. It's a division that Shane's leadership style has created, but that he seems unable to recognize or address. Glenn and Maggie's developing relationship provides a small refuge from the group's internal tensions, but even their growing intimacy is shaped by the stress of living under Shane's increasingly authoritarian rule. Maggie seeks comfort in Glenn's gentleness, partly because it represents everything that Shane's leadership philosophy has eliminated from the group's daily experience. Patience, consideration, recognition that individual emotional needs matter beyond their tactical implications. The empty hospital bed represents all of this mounting tension, all the ways Shane's unchallenged authority has created problems that Rick might have been able to navigate through his ability to balance competing values. Rick would have found a way to respect Herschel's beliefs while ensuring the group's safety. Rick would have acknowledged Carol's grief while maintaining group morale. Rick would have taught Carl about violence while preserving some connection to his humanity. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's response to the growing challenges to his authority is characteristically direct and uncompromising. When Dale brings up the possibility that some group members might be better served by leaving Shane's leadership, Shane's reaction reveals how far his thinking has evolved from the collaborative approach that characterized the group's early days. "Anyone who wants to leave is free to go," Shane says, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believes his value to the group's survival is so obvious that the threat of his absence should end any debate about his methods. But they leave without weapons, without supplies, and without any claim on the resources this group has secured. If they think they can do better on their own, they're welcome to prove it. The ultimatum is designed to end the discussion about alternative leadership by making the cost of dissent prohibitively high. It works in the sense that no one takes Shane up on his offer to leave, but it also reveals that Shane's version of leadership has evolved into something that treats loyalty as a tactical necessity, rather than something that should be earned through respect and effective decision-making. The schism in the group isn't just about leadership style or survival philosophy. It's about whether the people they're becoming under Shane's direction are people worth saving, and whether the community they're building is one that deserves to survive. Those are the questions the empty hospital bed represents, the questions Rick would have insisted they wrestle with, even in the middle of a crisis. But without Rick's voice in the conversation, those questions remain unexamined, and the group moves forward under Shane's leadership without ever resolving the fundamental tensions that are slowly tearing them apart. Chapter 5. Winter's Grip. There's a moment on day 85 when the group loads their few remaining possessions into Dale's RV and prepares to leave Herschel Green's farm that feels less like departure and more like exile. The Georgia autumn air carries the promise of a winter that will test every survival skill Shane has developed, every tactical decision that's kept them alive since the outbreak began. But what's genuinely worth examining about this moment isn't the practical challenge of finding shelter and resources before the cold sets in. It's the way Shane responds to Herschel's polite but firm request that they leave, by treating it as a tactical problem to be solved rather than a diplomatic failure to be learned from. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents something more complex than just Rick's absence. It represents the absence of someone who would have recognized that burning bridges with potential allies is a luxury no survivor group can afford in a world where winter means death for the unprepared, the bed that should have held someone capable of finding middle ground, someone who would have spent the time to repair the relationship with Herschel rather than accepting exile as an inevitable consequence of effective leadership. Shane's response to leaving the farm is characteristically practical and forward-focused. He organizes the group's departure with military efficiency, catalogues their resources, identifies potential shelter locations from his pre-outbreak knowledge of the region. What he doesn't do is acknowledge that his approach to the barn situation created this crisis, or consider whether different tactical choices might have preserved their relationship with their host. For Shane, the farm was always a temporary arrangement, and Herschel's demand that they leave simply accelerates a transition that was always inevitable. But the group is leaving the farm with fewer resources, fewer allies, and less cohesion than they had when they arrived. Carol's depression has deepened in the weeks since Sophia's death, her grief compounded by Shane's clinical approach to her loss and the group's pressure to move forward without adequate time to process what she's lost. Dale's health has begun to show signs of strain from the stress of constant conflict with Shane's leadership decisions. The temporary safety that Herschel's farm represented is gone, and winter in Georgia means survival challenges that will test whether Shane's tactical approach can preserve group unity when resources become critically scarce. By day 150, winter has settled over the Georgian landscape with the kind of bitter cold that makes every decision about resource allocation a matter of life and death. The group has found temporary shelter in an abandoned farmhouse about 40 miles from Herschel's property, but the building provides protection from the wind without solving the fundamental problems of food, fuel, and medical supplies that winter survival requires. Shane's response to these challenges reveals how far his leadership philosophy has evolved from the collaborative approach that characterized the group's early days. Here's what I find genuinely disturbing about Shane's approach to winter resource management. When the group's food stores reach critically low levels around day 160, Shane's solution isn't to search for abandoned supplies or to establish hunting protocols that might sustain them through the cold months. His solution is to locate other survivor groups and take what his people need to survive. The tactical logic is sound. Smaller groups are easier targets than large supply caches, and desperate survivors are often careless about security. But Shane's willingness to raid other survivors represents a moral line that Rick would have struggled to cross, a recognition that their survival now depends on ensuring other people don't survive. Laurie's pregnancy progresses through the winter months under conditions that would have been challenging even with adequate medical care and nutrition. By day 180, her condition has become obvious to everyone in the group, creating additional pressure on Shane's resource allocation decisions and additional complications for a leader whose approach to crisis management has eliminated emotional considerations as operational luxuries. Shane's response to Laurie's pregnancy is characteristically tactical. He reorganizes the group's sleeping arrangements to ensure she has adequate warmth, adjusts their travel schedule to account for her limited mobility, calculates the additional caloric requirements her condition will place on their already strained food stores. What Shane doesn't address, what he seems constitutionally unable to acknowledge, is that Laurie's pregnancy raises questions about the future that extend beyond resource management. In another timeline, Rick would have wrestled with the moral implications of bringing a child into a world where survival requires the kind of choices Shane has been making. He would have asked whether they were preserving something worth preserving, whether the community they were building was one a child could grow up in without losing everything that makes them human. But Shane approaches Laurie's pregnancy as he approaches every other challenge, as a tactical problem with tactical solutions, unencumbered by the kind of moral complexity that might interfere with effective decision-making. The first raid Shane organizes occurs on day 172, targeting a family of 5 who've established a small camp about 12 miles from the group's winter shelter. Shane's reconnaissance reveals that the family has managed to secure a significant cache of canned goods and medical supplies, resources that Shane's group needs to survive the rest of the winter. His tactical assessment is straightforward. 5 people, 2 of them children, minimal weapons, poor perimeter security. The raid can be executed cleanly, efficiently, with minimal risk to his own people. Daryl Dixon participates in the raid, despite his growing reservations about Shane's leadership methods, recognizing that his survival skills and his loyalty to the group supersede his personal discomfort with taking resources from other survivors. But what happens during the raid reveals something about Shane's approach to violence that should concern even his most pragmatic supporters. The family surrenders without resistance when Shane's team surrounds their camp, recognizing that they're outnumbered and outgunned. Shane's instructions to his team are clear. Take the supplies they need, leave enough for the family to survive a few more days, avoid unnecessary violence. But when the father of the family pleads with Shane to leave them enough food to keep his children alive through the winter, Shane's response reveals how far his thinking has evolved from anything that might be called compassionate leadership. "You should have secured your supplies better," Shane tells the man, his voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact tone he uses to explain tactical realities. This is how the world works now. The strong take from the weak. Your children's survival isn't my responsibility. Darrell watches this exchange with growing unease, recognizing that Shane's willingness to condemn children to starvation represents a moral boundary that he's not sure he can cross, even for the sake of group survival. But Shane's tactical effectiveness has kept them alive when other groups have fallen apart or died, and Darrell's loyalty to the people he's traveled with since the outbreak outweighs his discomfort with the methods their survival requires. The raid yields enough supplies to sustain Shane's group for another month, but it also yields something else, the knowledge that Shane's version of leadership has evolved into something that prioritizes their survival above any consideration of what their survival costs other people. Carol observes the aftermath of the raid with the kind of hypervigilance she's developed since Ed's death, recognizing that Shane's willingness to take resources from families with children represents a logical extension of his clinical approach to Sophia's death. For Shane, other people's children are potential threats or potential resources, but they're not moral considerations that complicate his decision-making process. Dale's health deteriorates significantly during the winter months, his age and the stress of constant conflict with Shane's leadership style taking a toll that Shane addresses as a resource management problem rather than a human tragedy. When Dale develops a persistent cough around day 190, Shane's calculation is straightforward. Medical supplies are limited. Dale's survival prospects are poor. Allocating resources to treat his condition would compromise the group's overall survival chances. Dale receives minimal care, enough to manage his symptoms, but not enough to address the underlying condition that's slowly killing him. Here's what makes Dale's deteriorating health particularly significant in terms of group dynamics. Dale represents the last consistent voice of moral opposition to Shane's increasingly authoritarian leadership style. His declining health eliminates the group's most articulate critic of Shane's methods at precisely the moment when Shane's desperation is driving him to make choices that would benefit from moral scrutiny. Without Dale's voice asking the hard questions about what they're becoming, Shane's tactical decisions face less resistance from within the group, even when those decisions involve taking resources from families with children or denying medical care to group members whose survival prospects don't justify the investment. The group fractures temporarily around day 200 when Glenn, Andrea, and T-Dog attempt to leave Shane's leadership and establish their own survival strategy. Their departure is prompted by Shane's announcement that the group will conduct additional raids on other survivor camps to secure enough resources to last through the remainder of winter. Glenn's objection to the plan is based on practical rather than moral considerations. He argues that raiding other survivors will eventually attract retaliation from larger, better organized groups, creating security risks that outweigh the short-term benefits of acquiring additional supplies. Shane's response to Glenn's tactical criticism reveals how far his leadership philosophy has moved from anything resembling democratic decision-making. Glenn, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't a debate. We need those supplies to survive. If you don't want to participate in getting them, you're free to find another group that shares your approach to survival. The ultimatum is designed to end the discussion before it can become a real challenge to Shane's authority. But Glenn's response surprises everyone, including Shane. Maybe I will, Glenn says quietly. Maybe we need to consider whether surviving the way you want us to survive is worth it. Glenn, Andrea, and T-Dog leave the group on day 201, taking minimal supplies and weapons, attempting to establish an alternative approach to winter survival that doesn't require raiding other survivor camps. Their departure lasts exactly 12 days. On day 213, they return to Shane's group, frostbitten, exhausted, and carrying the knowledge that Shane's harsh methods represent the only viable approach to survival in a world where resources are finite and winter is unforgiving. Their attempted independence fails not because Shane's leadership is ideal, but because the alternatives to Shane's leadership are worse. The reunion reveals something about Shane's approach to authority that the group hadn't fully understood before. Shane welcomes Glenn, Andrea, and T-Dog back without recrimination, without demands for apology, without any acknowledgement that their departure represented a challenge to his leadership. Instead, he treats their return as validation of his tactical assessments, proof that his methods work while alternatives fail. "Glad to have you back," Shane tells Glenn, his tone carrying genuine warmth, but also a subtle note of vindication. "Hope you learned what you needed to learn." The implication is clear. Shane's leadership isn't perfect, but it's effective, and anyone who objects to his methods is welcome to test their alternatives against the unforgiving reality of winter survival. Glenn's failed attempt at independence becomes evidence that Shane's harsh choices are necessities rather than preferences, tactical requirements rather than moral failures. Daryl's evolution into Shane's reluctant lieutenant occurs gradually throughout the winter months, driven more by practical recognition of Shane's effectiveness than by philosophical agreement with his methods. Daryl's survival skills, hunting ability, and tactical experience make him invaluable to the group's security, but his growing role as Shane's second-in-command comes with moral compromises that he struggles to reconcile with his own sense of right and wrong. When Shane organizes the second raid on day 220, targeting a group of 8 survivors who've established a camp in an abandoned gas station, Daryl's participation is essential to the mission's success. His tracking skills allow Shane's team to approach undetected. His marksmanship ensures that resistance is minimal. His knowledge of rural Georgia helps them escape with their acquired supplies before any potential allies can respond. But Daryl's effectiveness in supporting Shane's tactical objectives doesn't eliminate his awareness that they're becoming something that Rick would have struggled to recognize. The empty hospital bed represents all of this moral complexity that Shane's leadership has streamlined out of their survival strategy. Rick would have understood that winter survival required difficult choices, but he would have insisted on finding ways to make those choices that preserved some connection to the idea that other people's lives matter. Rick would have looked for diplomatic solutions before resorting to raids, would have sought collaborative approaches to resource sharing rather than zero-sum competition for supplies. Rick would have asked whether the people they were becoming in order to survive winter were people worth saving. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's methods work. The group survives the winter with minimal casualties, adequate nutrition, and sufficient medical supplies to address most of the health problems that cold weather exacerbates. Shane's willingness to raid other survivors, to prioritize his people's needs above moral considerations, to treat resource allocation as a tactical problem rather than a humanitarian challenge, keeps them alive when other approaches might have failed. By day 250, when winter begins to give way to early spring, the group has survived the harshest test of their cohesion and Shane's leadership. But they've survived by becoming something different than they were at the beginning of winter. Something harder, more ruthless, more willing to treat other survivors as obstacles to their own survival rather than fellow human beings deserving of moral consideration. Carol's depression has deepened through the winter months. Her grief over Sophia's death compounded by her growing awareness that the group she's traveling with has become capable of choices that would have been unthinkable in the early days after the outbreak. Dale's health continues to deteriorate, his persistent cough now accompanied by weight loss and fatigue that suggest his condition will become terminal without medical intervention that Shane's resource calculations can't justify. Glenn, Andrea, and T-Dog have returned to the group with the knowledge that Shane's harsh methods represent the only viable approach to survival, even when those methods require moral compromises that none of them would have considered before the outbreak. And Shane has proven that his tactical approach to leadership can keep people alive through conditions that would have destroyed groups with less effective decision-making processes. His willingness to raid other survivors, to prioritize his people's needs above competing moral claims, to treat winter survival as a military campaign rather than a humanitarian crisis, has preserved the lives of everyone under his protection. But it's also transformed them into something that the empty hospital bed represents. A group of survivors whose approach to staying alive has eliminated everything that Rick would have insisted was worth preserving about human community. Winter's grip is loosening, but its effects on the group will resonate through every decision they make going forward. They've learned to survive by becoming predators, and spring will test whether they can remember how to be anything else. Chapter 6. The Prison Discovery. There's a moment on day 300 when Shane Walsh first sets eyes on the West Georgia Correctional Facility that feels less like discovery and more like recognition. The prison sits behind its double perimeter fences, like a fortress designed by someone who understood exactly what the post-outbreak world would require. High walls, clear sight lines, defensible positions, and infrastructure built to contain threats rather than welcome visitors. Shane's tactical assessment of the facility is immediate and comprehensive, his years of law enforcement training allowing him to see past the walker-filled yard to the strategic advantages that concrete walls and steel doors represent in a world where security determines survival. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again. But now it represents something more complex than just Rick's absence. It represents the absence of someone who would have approached the prison as a potential home rather than a military installation. Someone who would have seen the facility's potential for community building rather than just defensive positioning. The bed that should have held someone who understood that how you take a place shapes what you become once you're inside it. Someone who would have asked whether turning the prison into a fortress was worth the cost of turning its inhabitants into soldiers. Shane's approach to clearing the prison reveals how far his leadership philosophy has evolved from the collaborative decision-making that characterized the group's early days. Rather than gathering input from the group about strategy or discussing the risks and benefits of attempting to secure such a large facility, Shane conducts his own tactical assessment and presents the group with a completed operational plan. The prison represents the kind of strategic advantage that Shane's military training has taught him to recognize and exploit, a defensible position that could provide long-term security if properly cleared and fortified. "This is it," Shane announces to the group as they observe the facility from a ridge about half a mile away. "This is where we stop running." Here's what I find genuinely significant about Shane's presentation of the prison plan to the group. He doesn't ask for their opinions about whether attempting to take the facility is worth the risk. He doesn't invite discussion about alternative approaches to securing the building or managing the walker population inside. Shane presents the prison assault as a fait accompli, a tactical necessity that flows logically from their current situation and their need for permanent shelter. The group's role in the operation isn't to participate in strategic planning. It's to execute the plan Shane has already developed. Dale, his health continuing to deteriorate from his winter illness, attempts to raise questions about the wisdom of committing the group to such a dangerous operation without more careful consideration of alternatives. "Shane, Maybe we should scout other locations. There might be facilities that don't require us to fight through hundreds of walkers to... Shane's response is immediate and final. Dale, I appreciate your concern, but we've been looking for a place like this since we left Atlanta. Defensible perimeter, sustainable infrastructure, enough space for long-term settlement. We're not going to find a better option. And winter proved we can't keep living hand to mouth. The dismissal is polite but absolute, revealing how completely Shane's leadership style has eliminated democratic input from operational planning. Shane's tactical assessment of the prison is probably correct. The facility does represent their best chance for long-term security, but his refusal to allow group discussion about the risks and alternatives shows how far his authority has evolved from anything resembling collaborative decision-making. Shane's strategy for clearing the prison differs drastically from the approach Rick would have taken, prioritizing speed and overwhelming force over careful, methodical progress. Rather than clearing the facility section by section over the course of several days, Shane designs an operation that will secure the entire outer yard and multiple cell blocks in a single coordinated assault. His plan requires every member of the group to participate in active combat, including Carol and Dale despite their physical limitations, because Shane's assessment shows that partial commitment to the operation creates unacceptable risks for mission failure. The assault on the prison begins at dawn on day 301, with Shane's team executing a plan that combines noise discipline, coordinated movement, and overwhelming firepower to eliminate the walker population as efficiently as possible. Shane assigns specific sectors to each team member, establishes rally points for regrouping if the operation encounters unexpected resistance, and creates fallback positions if the assault needs to be aborted. The military precision of Shane's planning reflects his understanding that the prison represents their last opportunity for permanent settlement, a tactical objective that justifies the risks involved in attempting to take it. Daryl's role in the prison assault reveals how completely he's evolved into Shane's second-in-command, despite his continuing reservations about Shane's leadership methods. Daryl's crossbow and his ability to eliminate walkers silently make him essential to the operation's success, but his participation in Shane's tactical plan represents a form of loyalty that extends beyond personal agreement with Shane's decisions. Daryl recognizes that the group's survival depends on Shane's effectiveness as a leader, even when that effectiveness requires moral compromises that Daryl struggles to accept. The prison yard is secured within 6 hours, the cell blocks cleared and fortified within 3 days. Shane's operation succeeds because of his tactical planning, his team's discipline, and his willingness to accept casualties if necessary to achieve strategic objectives. T-Dog suffers a deep cut during the clearing operation, the kind of injury that would have become infected and potentially fatal under the medical conditions the group has been living with since leaving the farm. But Shane's preparation for the prison assault included securing antibiotics and surgical supplies specifically for treating combat injuries, reflecting his understanding that successful operations require medical support for their participants. Here's what makes Shane's approach to the prison clearing particularly significant. T-Dog receives immediate medical attention, not because Shane values T-Dog's individual welfare, but because Shane's tactical doctrine prioritizes maintaining the operational readiness of all team members. T-Dog's survival isn't guaranteed by Shane's compassion, it's guaranteed by Shane's recognition that losing experienced fighters compromises the group's long-term security. The distinction matters because it reveals how Shane's leadership philosophy has evolved to preserve individual lives through strategic calculation rather than humanitarian concern. Once the prison is secured, Shane immediately establishes the kind of hierarchical command structure that his military training suggests is necessary for managing a permanent settlement. Guard duties are assigned by rotation rather than volunteer basis. Resource allocation is determined by Shane's assessment of individual needs rather than democratic discussion, and decision-making authority remains centralized in Shane's command structure rather than distributed among group members. The prison becomes a military installation under Shane's leadership, efficient and secure, but organized around principles of authority and discipline rather than collaboration and consent. Laurie's pregnancy reaches full term during the prison clearing operation, and her labor begins on day 309 while the group is still establishing their permanent settlement in the facility. But unlike the emergency conditions that characterized Carl's medical crisis at Herschel's farm, Laurie's delivery occurs under conditions that Shane has specifically prepared for through his tactical planning. Shane's medical supply acquisition during the winter months included prenatal vitamins, sterile surgical equipment, and antibiotics specifically for treating post-delivery complications. Laurie gives birth to Judith in a clean, well-lit cell block with adequate medical support, because Shane's preparation for the prison operation included planning for every medical emergency the group might face during their transition to permanent settlement. The successful delivery represents a triumph of Shane's tactical approach to crisis management, but it also represents something more complex about the kind of community the group has become under his leadership. Judith is born into a world where her survival has been guaranteed by strategic planning rather than luck, where her mother's safety has been ensured by military-style preparation rather than improvised response to crisis. But she's also born into a community where individual needs are subordinated to strategic objectives, where decision-making authority rests with a single leader whose word is absolute, where the security that protects her comes at the cost of the democratic values that Rick would have insisted were worth preserving. Herschel Green's family integration into the prison community occurs more smoothly than it would have under Rick's leadership, because Shane's hierarchical command structure eliminates the kind of jurisdictional conflicts that might have arisen between different leadership philosophies. Shane approaches Herschel not as a potential co-leader whose input should be solicited and respected, but as a valuable specialist whose medical expertise serves strategic objectives determined by Shane's command decisions. Herschel's authority within the prison extends to medical matters and agricultural planning, but it doesn't extend to questioning Shane's tactical decisions or proposing alternative approaches to community management. The arrangement works because Shane's respect for Herschel's expertise is genuine and his delegation of authority in specific areas is real, but it also works because Herschel has learned from his conflict with Shane at the farm that challenging Shane's operational decisions creates problems that extend beyond the immediate disagreement. Herschel's integration into Shane's command structure represents a form of diplomatic accommodation that preserves Herschel's valuable contributions while acknowledging Shane's ultimate authority over all strategic decisions. Carol's psychological recovery from Sophia's death begins to accelerate once the group achieves the security that the prison provides. But her recovery occurs within the framework of Shane's military-style community organization. Carol's assigned duties include perimeter patrol, inventory management, and combat training, responsibilities that require her to function as a soldier rather than a grieving mother. Shane's approach to Carol's psychological rehabilitation prioritizes returning her to operational effectiveness over addressing the emotional complexity of her loss, reflecting his belief that individual healing occurs most effectively through productive contribution to group security. The approach works in the sense that Carol becomes a more effective fighter and a more reliable team member under Shane's training regimen. But it works by channeling Carol's grief into tactical skills, rather than helping her process the emotional weight of losing her child. Carol learns to eliminate walkers with mechanical efficiency, to secure perimeters with professional attention to detail, to manage resources with military discipline. She becomes exactly the kind of community member that Shane's leadership philosophy produces: competent, reliable, effective, and emotionally detached from the human costs of survival. Dale's health continues to deteriorate even after the group achieves the security of the prison, his winter illness having progressed to the point where Shane's medical preparations can manage his symptoms but not reverse the underlying condition that's slowly killing him. Shane's response to Dale's declining health is characteristically tactical. Dale's duties are reassigned to other group members, his medical care is managed to maximize his remaining productivity, his expertise is documented so that his knowledge can be preserved after his death. What Shane doesn't address, what his leadership philosophy seems constitutionally unable to acknowledge, is that Dale's approaching death represents the loss of more than just tactical knowledge and operational capability. Dale has been the group's most consistent voice of moral opposition to Shane's authoritarian methods, the member most willing to ask hard questions about what they're becoming under Shane's leadership. Dale's death, when it comes, will eliminate the last systematic challenge to Shane's authority, leaving the group without anyone willing or able to provide the kind of moral scrutiny that democratic leadership requires. The empty hospital bed represents all of this moral complexity that Shane's successful settlement of the prison has streamlined out of their community structure. Rick would have understood that how they established their permanent settlement would determine what kind of people they became while living in it. Rick would have insisted on democratic input into strategic decisions, on collaborative approaches to resource allocation, on community structures that preserved individual autonomy alongside collective security. Rick would have asked whether the efficiency of Shane's military-style organization was worth the cost of eliminating the kind of collaborative decision-making that makes survival worthwhile rather than just possible. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's methods work. The prison is secure, the group has achieved permanent shelter, their resource needs are met, their medical requirements are addressed, their security is guaranteed by walls and weapons and strategic planning. Shane's tactical approach to community building has created exactly the kind of settlement that his military training suggested would be necessary for long-term survival in the post-outbreak world. What the group is beginning to understand, though they haven't articulated it yet, is that Shane's version of security comes with costs that extend beyond individual freedom. They've achieved safety by becoming soldiers in Shane's army, permanent settlement by accepting permanent hierarchy, community by subordinating individual autonomy to collective discipline. The prison provides everything they need to survive indefinitely, but it provides it within a command structure that has eliminated democratic participation as an operational luxury they can't afford. By day 315, the prison settlement has become a model of tactical efficiency and strategic success. Guard rotations function with military precision. Resource allocation operates according to clear chains of command. Medical needs are addressed through systematic preparation and disciplined implementation. The group has achieved everything Shane promised them when he first announced the prison assault: security, sustainability, permanent shelter, protection from external threats. But they've achieved it by becoming something that the empty hospital bed represents the absence of: a community that might have preserved democratic values alongside defensive capabilities, collaborative decision-making alongside tactical effectiveness, individual autonomy alongside collective security. Shane's success in establishing the prison settlement represents the logical endpoint of his leadership philosophy, a demonstration that authoritarian methods can create stable, secure, sustainable communities when democratic alternatives might fail. The question that remains unanswered, the question the empty hospital bed continues to represent, is whether the people they've become in order to achieve that security are people worth saving, and whether the community they've built is one that preserves anything beyond biological survival. Those are the questions Rick would have insisted they wrestle with, even in the moment of their greatest strategic success. But without Rick's voice in the conversation, those questions remain unexamined, and the group settles into their new home without ever resolving the fundamental tensions between survival and humanity that the prison's security has temporarily obscured. Chapter 7. Woodbury Contact. There's a moment on day 320 when Michonne appears at the prison's outer fence, katana drawn and walker blood drying on her face, that represents the first challenge to the isolated security Shane has built for his community. She stands at the gate like a messenger from a world that Shane's tactical planning hasn't accounted for, carrying information about threats and opportunities that exist beyond the concrete walls and steel bars that have defined their reality for the past 3 weeks. What Michonne tells them about the town called Woodbury will force Shane to confront a fundamental question his leadership philosophy hasn't prepared him to answer. What happens when your approach to survival encounters someone else's approach to survival, and both approaches can't coexist in the same region? The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents the absence of someone who would have approached contact with other survivor communities as an opportunity for diplomacy rather than a prelude to conflict. The bed that should have held someone capable of seeing potential allies where Shane sees potential threats, someone who would have asked whether coexistence was possible before concluding that competition was inevitable. Instead, we have Shane, whose tactical training has taught him to assess other armed groups as hostile until proven otherwise, and whose recent experience leading the group has reinforced his belief that survival is a zero-sum competition for finite resources. Michonne's account of Woodbury reveals a community that operates according to principles fundamentally similar to Shane's approach to leadership: centralized authority, military discipline, strategic resource management, and prioritization of group security above individual autonomy. Philip Blake, the man Woodbury calls the governor, has built a town that functions as efficiently as Shane's prison, with clear chains of command, systematic resource allocation, and defensive capabilities designed to protect the community from external threats. But what makes Michonne's information particularly significant is her assessment that the governor's leadership style has evolved beyond tactical pragmatism into something that prioritizes control for its own sake, rather than control as a means of ensuring group survival. Shane's response to Michonne's intelligence about Woodbury reveals how far his thinking has evolved from anything resembling diplomatic consideration of other communities. Rather than treating the governor's town as a potential ally or trade partner, Shane immediately begins tactical assessment of Woodbury as a potential threat that will eventually require military response. His questions for Michonne focus on defensive capabilities, weapons inventory, patrol schedules, and tactical vulnerabilities, rather than diplomatic opportunities or collaborative arrangements that might benefit both communities. "How many fighters?" Shane asks, his tone carrying the careful precision of someone gathering intelligence for operational planning rather than diplomatic outreach. 30, maybe 40 who can handle weapons effectively, Michonne responds, recognizing the tactical nature of Shane's inquiry. The governor keeps them organized, disciplined. They're not just survivors with guns, they're soldiers. Weapons? Military grade, assault rifles, ammunition, vehicles. They've got resources. Shane's tactical assessment concludes that Woodbury represents a potential challenge to his community's regional security, a well-armed and well-organized group whose proximity to the prison creates unacceptable strategic risks for long-term planning. Rather than considering whether diplomatic contact might establish peaceful coexistence between the two communities, Shane begins planning for eventual conflict based on his assumption that two military-style survival groups cannot operate in the same region without eventually competing for resources and strategic advantages. Here's what I find genuinely disturbing about Shane's approach to the Woodbury intelligence. He doesn't consider whether the governor's community might be willing to establish trade relationships, mutual defense agreements, or territorial arrangements that could benefit both groups. Shane's leadership philosophy has evolved to the point where he sees other organized survivor groups as threats to be eliminated rather than communities to be negotiated with. His military training has taught him that tactical superiority requires eliminating potential competitors before they can become actual threats, and his experience leading the group through winter has reinforced his belief that survival resources are finite and must be secured through strength rather than diplomacy. The test of Shane's tactical assessment comes on day 325, when Glenn and Maggie fail to return from a routine supply run to a pharmacy about 12 miles from the prison. Their absence becomes a crisis when Michonne confirms that their route would have taken them through territory that Woodbury patrols regularly, suggesting that the governor's people have either captured or killed two members of Shane's community. Shane's response to their disappearance reveals how completely his leadership style has eliminated diplomatic solutions from his operational planning. Rather than attempting to establish contact with Woodbury to negotiate Glenn and Maggie's release, Shane begins immediate preparation for a rescue operation designed to extract his people through overwhelming force. His tactical plan involves infiltrating Woodbury, locating Glenn and Maggie, and extracting them through military assault rather than diplomatic arrangement. Shane's assumption is that the governor's people represent hostile forces whose cooperation cannot be secured through negotiation, only through superior tactical execution and willingness to use lethal force. Daryl's participation in Shane's rescue plan reflects his complete evolution into Shane's second-in-command, despite his continuing moral reservations about Shane's methods. Daryl's tracking skills and his knowledge of rural Georgia make him essential to the operation, but his willingness to participate in what amounts to an act of war against another community reveals how completely his loyalty to Shane and to the group has overridden his personal discomfort with Shane's increasingly aggressive approach to external threats. "We go in quiet, we find them, we get out," Shane explains to his assault team, outlining an operation that prioritizes speed and violence over any consideration of diplomatic alternatives. No negotiation, no prisoner exchange, no giving them time to organize a response. We hit them before they know we're there, and we're gone before they can retaliate. The rescue operation launches at dawn on day 326, less than 24 hours after Glenn and Maggie's disappearance. Shane's team consists of himself, Daryl, T-Dog, and Carl, reflecting Shane's assessment that the mission requires maximum tactical capability and his willingness to include an 11-year-old boy in a military assault if that boy's shooting skills contribute to mission success. The inclusion of Carl in the assault team reveals how completely Shane's thinking has evolved beyond anything resembling protection of childhood innocence, treating Carl as a tactical asset whose combat training justifies his participation in operations that would traumatize most adults. The assault on Woodbury succeeds through superior tactical planning and Shane's willingness to use lethal force without hesitation. Shane's team penetrates the town's perimeter defenses, locates Glenn and Maggie in a building that serves as Woodbury's detention facility, and extracts them through coordinated violence that leaves 7 Woodbury residents dead and their defensive positions compromised. The operation demonstrates Shane's tactical expertise and his team's effectiveness under combat conditions, but it also represents a declaration of war against a community that might have been willing to negotiate Glenn and Maggie's release through diplomatic means. Here's what makes the rescue operation particularly significant in terms of Shane's leadership evolution. The mission succeeds not just because of superior tactical planning, but because Shane's approach to violence has eliminated the kind of moral hesitation that might have compromised the operation's effectiveness. When Shane encounters Woodbury guards who attempt to surrender rather than fight, his response is swift and final. Surrender doesn't eliminate the tactical threat these individuals represent to mission success, so Shane eliminates them as efficiently as he would eliminate walkers that blocked his path to the objective. Carl's participation in the killing of surrendering guards represents a moment that would have horrified Rick, but that Shane treats as evidence of Carl's successful development into an effective member of the community's military capability. Carl's willingness to shoot unarmed prisoners doesn't concern Shane, because Shane's tactical doctrine has eliminated the distinction between legitimate military targets and potential future threats. For Shane, anyone who might interfere with mission objectives represents a tactical problem to be solved through application of lethal force. Glenn and Maggie's rescue succeeds, but their accounts of their treatment in Woodbury reveal information that complicates Shane's tactical assessment of the governor as an enemy. The governor's interrogation of Glenn and Maggie focused on gathering intelligence about the prison community's capabilities and resources, suggesting that the governor was considering diplomatic contact with Shane's group before Shane's assault eliminated that possibility. Glenn and Maggie report that their capture was intended as preliminary intelligence gathering for potential trade negotiations, not as preparation for military assault against the prison. The revelation that Shane's rescue operation may have eliminated diplomatic opportunities that could have benefited both communities doesn't alter Shane's assessment that the assault was tactically correct. Shane's leadership philosophy has evolved to prioritize immediate tactical success over long-term strategic considerations, and the successful rescue of Glenn and Maggie validates his operational planning, regardless of what alternative approaches might have achieved. Shane's response to the possibility that diplomatic solutions might have been available is characteristically pragmatic. Diplomatic solutions require trusting potential enemies, and Shane's experience has taught him that survival depends on eliminating threats before they can eliminate you. The governor's retaliation begins within hours of Shane's assault on Woodbury, arriving faster and harder than the same conflict would have unfolded in another timeline, because Shane's aggressive approach has eliminated any possibility of diplomatic resolution. Rather than attempting to establish communication with the prison community, to negotiate territorial boundaries or resource-sharing arrangements, the governor treats Shane's assault as evidence that the prison group represents an existential threat that must be eliminated through military action. The governor's first retaliatory strike targets the prison's outer perimeter on day 327, testing Shane's defensive preparations and demonstrating that Woodbury's military capability exceeds Shane's tactical estimates. The attack involves coordinated assault teams, vehicle-mounted weapons, and tactical coordination that reveals the governor's people as more than just well-armed survivors. They operate with military precision that matches Shane's own tactical capabilities, creating a conflict between two communities whose leadership philosophies have evolved in parallel directions. Andrea's position in Woodbury becomes critically dangerous as the conflict escalates, her relationship with the governor creating complications that Shane's tactical planning hasn't accounted for. Andrea has been living in Woodbury since separating from the group during their winter wandering, and her integration into the governor's community has given her access to strategic information about both communities that makes her valuable to both sides. But Shane's assault on Woodbury has eliminated any possibility that Andrea can serve as a diplomatic bridge between the two communities, forcing her to choose sides in a conflict that her presence might have prevented. The governor's use of Andrea as a source of intelligence about the prison community's capabilities reveals his tactical sophistication and his willingness to manipulate personal relationships for strategic advantage. Andrea's knowledge of Shane's leadership style, the prison's defensive positions, and the group's individual capabilities gives the governor operational intelligence that significantly improves his chances of successfully assaulting the prison. But Andrea's cooperation with the governor's intelligence gathering also represents a betrayal of the community she traveled with for months, a choice to prioritize her immediate safety in Woodbury over her loyalty to people who protected her through the early months of the outbreak. Shane's response to Andrea's cooperation with the governor is characteristically tactical and unsentimental. Rather than treating Andrea's situation as a humanitarian crisis that requires rescue operations, Shane reclassifies Andrea from community member to enemy intelligence asset, someone whose knowledge of the prison's vulnerabilities makes her a legitimate target for elimination if the opportunity arises. Shane's tactical doctrine has eliminated personal relationships as factors that complicate operational decision-making, allowing him to treat former group members as enemy combatants if their actions serve hostile strategic objectives. The escalating conflict between the prison and Woodbury represents the logical collision between two survival communities whose leadership philosophies have evolved in the same direction, toward authoritarian control, military discipline, and zero-sum competition for regional resources. Shane and the governor operate according to fundamentally similar tactical doctrines, prioritizing their own community's security above all other considerations, and treating external threats as problems to be solved through superior application of organized violence. But what makes this conflict particularly significant is that it represents the first test of Shane's leadership against an opponent whose tactical capabilities match his own. The governor's community operates with the same military efficiency that Shane has developed at the prison, the same willingness to use lethal force to achieve strategic objectives, the same subordination of individual autonomy to collective security requirements. The conflict isn't between different survival philosophies. It's between identical survival philosophies competing for the same resources and strategic advantages. The empty hospital bed represents all the diplomatic alternatives that Shane's tactical approach has eliminated from consideration. Rick would have approached contact with Woodbury as an opportunity to establish trade relationships, mutual defense agreements, or territorial arrangements that could benefit both communities without requiring military conflict. Rick would have seen the governor's community as potential allies rather than inevitable enemies, fellow survivors whose cooperation might strengthen both groups' chances of long-term survival. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's methods reflect his fundamental belief that survival in the post-outbreak world requires treating other armed groups as threats to be eliminated rather than communities to be negotiated with. Shane's successful rescue of Glenn and Maggie validates his tactical approach, but it also commits both communities to a conflict that will test whether military efficiency can substitute for diplomatic wisdom in managing relationships between survivor groups. The war between the prison and Woodbury begins not because coexistence was impossible, but because Shane's leadership philosophy has eliminated coexistence as a strategic option. Two communities that might have strengthened each other through cooperation will instead destroy each other through competition, and the survivors of that conflict will carry the knowledge that Shane's approach to leadership creates enemies as efficiently as it eliminates threats. By day 330, the conflict has escalated beyond reconnaissance and probing attacks to systematic warfare between two military-style communities, whose leaders have concluded that regional security requires eliminating the competition. Shane's tactical expertise has proven effective against individual walkers, desperate survivor groups, and resource scarcity. But now it faces its ultimate test: whether authoritarian efficiency can defeat authoritarian efficiency when both sides operate according to identical survival philosophies, and neither side recognizes any alternative to total victory. Chapter 8. The Governor's War. There's a sound at 4:17 Beseinmep on day 330 that transforms the prison from a secure community into a battlefield. The distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds, followed by the explosion that tears through the outer fence and signals the beginning of the most systematic military assault Shane's group has faced since the outbreak began. The Governor's response to Shane's raid on Woodbury isn't the probing attack or diplomatic ultimatum that might have characterized conflict in another timeline. It's a coordinated military operation designed to eliminate the prison community entirely, launched with the kind of overwhelming force that only becomes possible when two authoritarian survival groups decide that coexistence is impossible, and total victory is the only acceptable outcome. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents something more urgent than just Rick's absent moral voice. It represents the absence of someone who would have recognized that the escalating conflict between two military-style communities could only end in mutual destruction, someone who would have sought de-escalation even in the middle of active warfare, the bed that should have held someone capable of finding diplomatic solutions when military solutions had failed, someone who understood that winning a war isn't the same thing as preserving what makes winning worthwhile. Shane's response to the Governor's assault reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has evolved to prioritize tactical effectiveness above all other considerations, including the long-term sustainability of his community. Rather than attempting to establish communication with the Governor to negotiate terms for ending the conflict, Shane immediately begins implementation of defensive strategies designed to turn the prison into an impregnable fortress where his people can outlast any siege the Governor's forces can sustain. The transformation of the prison from community to military installation occurs within hours of the initial assault. Shane's contingency planning for external threats has included preparation for exactly this kind of systematic attack, and his response demonstrates the tactical sophistication that months of authoritarian leadership have allowed him to develop. Guard towers are reinforced with steel plates, killing fields are established in the outer yard, ammunition is distributed to every community member, regardless of age or previous combat experience, and non-combatants are relocated to the most secure sections of the cell block structure, where they can contribute to defense without being exposed to direct enemy fire. Here's what I find genuinely significant about Shane's defensive strategy. It succeeds precisely because Shane has spent months preparing his community for war rather than building it for peace. The prison's transformation into a fortress doesn't require fundamental changes to the community's organization because Shane's leadership has already structured the group according to military principles. Guard rotations, weapons training, resource allocation, and chain of command authority all operate according to tactical doctrines that transfer seamlessly from community management to active combat operations. Herschel Green's survival through the initial assault occurs not because of luck or medical expertise, but because Shane's defensive planning has prioritized protecting valuable community members whose skills contribute to long-term survival. Rather than allowing Herschel to participate in perimeter defense, where his age and limited mobility would make him a liability, Shane's tactical doctrine assigns Herschel to the secure medical station, where his expertise can save lives without exposing him to enemy fire. Herschel's survival represents the logical result of Shane's clinical approach to resource management, treating human lives as strategic assets to be deployed according to their maximum tactical utility. The siege that follows the initial assault lasts for 3 weeks and 17 days, from day 330 to day 351, representing the longest sustained military operation either community has attempted since the outbreak began. The governor's forces establish positions outside the prison's perimeter and begin systematic attacks designed to wear down Shane's defensive capabilities through attrition rather than overwhelming assault. But the governor's tactical assessment has underestimated Shane's preparation for exactly this kind of sustained conflict, and the prison's defensive advantages prove more significant than Woodbury's superior numbers and equipment. Shane's counterattack strategy reflects his understanding that defensive warfare requires offensive operations to maintain initiative and prevent the enemy from consolidating superior positions. Rather than waiting for the governor's forces to probe for weaknesses in the prison's defenses, Shane organizes night raids designed to disrupt enemy supply lines, eliminate advanced positions, and maintain psychological pressure on Woodbury forces whose morale depends on their belief in eventual victory through superior resources. Daryl Dixon's evolution into Shane's most effective lieutenant reaches its culmination during the siege, his combat experience and tactical instincts making him essential to the prison's defensive success. Daryl's ability to move silently through hostile territory, eliminate enemy sentries without alerting nearby forces, and gather intelligence about Woodbury's tactical plans gives Shane operational advantages that compensate for the prison's disadvantage in total numbers. But Daryl's effectiveness in supporting Shane's military operations comes at the cost of any remaining moral reservations about the methods their survival requires. When Shane assigns Daryl to lead a raid on day 338 targeting Woodbury's ammunition depot, Daryl's tactical execution results in the deaths of 12 enemy combatants and the destruction of resources that significantly degrade the governor's ability to sustain the siege. The operation succeeds because Daryl has learned to apply Shane's clinical approach to violence, eliminating enemy personnel with the same mechanical efficiency he brings to hunting walkers. Daryl's transformation from reluctant participant in Shane's authority to willing executor of Shane's tactical decisions represents the logical endpoint of Shane's leadership philosophy. Even those who initially resist authoritarian methods eventually adopt them when survival depends on tactical effectiveness. Carol Pelletier's emergence as a skilled fighter during the siege represents perhaps the most dramatic character transformation the conflict produces. Carol's depression and grief following Sophia's death have been channeled through Shane's training regimen into combat skills that make her one of the prison's most effective defenders. Her small size and quiet demeanor allow her to move through the prison's defensive positions without attracting enemy attention, while her knowledge of the facility's layout helps her establish ambush positions that maximize the tactical advantage of fighting from prepared defensive terrain. But what makes Carol's evolution particularly significant is that her effectiveness as a fighter comes at the cost of everything that originally made her sympathetic as a character. Carol's grief over Sophia's death has been transformed into mechanical hatred of external threats. Her protective instincts toward children have been redirected into killing anyone who threatens the community's children. Her gentle demeanor has been replaced by the kind of cold efficiency that Shane's leadership philosophy produces in everyone who survives long enough to master its requirements. The conflict's intensity escalates throughout the 3-week siege, as both sides commit resources and personnel to achieving total victory rather than negotiated settlement. The governor's forces lose 17 fighters to Shane's defensive operations, while the prison community loses T-Dog on day 342 when a mortar round penetrates the outer wall and kills him while he's coordinating ammunition distribution. T-Dog's death represents the first casualty of Shane's inner circle since the group established the prison settlement, and Shane's response reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has eliminated emotional processing of individual losses during active combat operations. T-Dog was a good soldier, Shane tells the group during the brief memorial service held in the secure cell block. He died protecting his community. That's what soldiers do. That's what we all do. The memorial is brief, tactical, focused on T-Dog's contribution to community defense, rather than his individual humanity or the personal loss his death represents to people who traveled with him for months. Shane's approach to T-Dog's death reflects his understanding that prolonged grief compromises operational effectiveness during active military operations, and that community morale depends on treating individual casualties as acceptable costs of achieving strategic objectives rather than personal tragedies that might undermine commitment to continued fighting. Shane's tactical doctrine during the siege includes systematic targeting of Woodbury's leadership structure, recognizing that the governor's authoritarian community will collapse if its command authority is eliminated. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the governor or seeking terms that might end the conflict through diplomatic means, Shane organizes assassination attempts designed to eliminate the governor and his key lieutenants through sniper attacks, explosive devices, and infiltration operations that prioritize killing enemy leadership over capturing territory or resources. The final assault on Woodbury occurs on day 349, when Shane's intelligence gathering reveals that the governor's forces have been weakened by casualties and resource depletion to the point where a coordinated attack might eliminate Woodbury's military capability entirely. Shane's operation involves every combat-capable member of the prison community, including Carl, whose marksmanship skills have improved under Shane's training to the point where his participation significantly increases the mission's chances of success. Carl's role in the final assault represents the logical endpoint of Shane's approach to childhood development in the post-outbreak world. At 11 years old, Carl operates as an effective sniper whose combat skills rival those of adult fighters. But his participation in systematic warfare against another human community reflects the complete elimination of childhood innocence that Shane's survival philosophy considers an operational luxury. Carl kills 3 Woodbury defenders during the final assault, and his clinical efficiency in eliminating enemy personnel demonstrates how completely Shane's training has transformed him into exactly the kind of child soldier that this world produces when survival requires tactical effectiveness above humanitarian considerations. The destruction of Woodbury occurs over the course of 18 hours, from the initial assault on day 349 through the final clearing operations that conclude on day 350. Shane's tactical plan involves simultaneous attacks on Woodbury's defensive positions, followed by systematic elimination of remaining resistance, followed by complete destruction of the town's infrastructure to prevent any surviving Woodbury forces from re-establishing their community. The operation succeeds because Shane's tactical planning has eliminated humanitarian constraints that might have limited the scope of destruction. allowing his forces to treat enemy civilians as legitimate military targets whose elimination contributes to strategic objectives. The governor's death occurs during hand-to-hand combat with Shane in Woodbury's command center on day 350, representing the culmination of a conflict between two leaders whose approaches to survival have evolved in identical directions. Both Shane and the governor have built communities according to authoritarian principles. Both have prioritized tactical effectiveness above democratic values. Both have treated external threats as problems to be solved through superior application of organized violence. Their final confrontation represents the collision between identical survival philosophies competing for the same resources and strategic advantages. But what makes the governor's death particularly significant is that Shane's victory doesn't resolve the fundamental problems that created the conflict between the two communities. Shane's tactical superiority has eliminated the immediate threat that Woodbury represented, but it's also demonstrated that his approach to survival inevitably leads to warfare with other communities whose leaders operate according to similar authoritarian principles. The governor's death proves that Shane's methods work in military conflict, but it also suggests that Shane's leadership philosophy will continue producing enemies as long as other survivor groups exist in the region. The complete destruction of Woodbury concludes on day 351, when Shane's forces finish eliminating the town's infrastructure and extracting useful resources for transport back to the prison. The operation yields significant material benefits: weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, vehicles, and fuel that will improve the prison community's long-term sustainability. But it also yields something else: the knowledge that Shane's approach to leadership has evolved to the point where he's willing to eliminate entire communities to ensure his own community's security. The empty hospital bed represents all the diplomatic alternatives that might have prevented the 3-week war between two communities whose survival interests didn't actually conflict until their leadership philosophies made coexistence impossible. Rick would have recognized that both communities faced the same fundamental challenges, and that cooperation might have strengthened both groups' chances of long-term survival. Rick would have sought negotiated solutions to territorial disputes, collaborative approaches to resource sharing, diplomatic frameworks for managing conflicts that didn't require total war. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's methods have proven devastatingly effective against external military threats. The prison community emerges from the siege stronger in terms of material resources, more secure in terms of regional threats, and more unified in terms of group cohesion under Shane's leadership. Shane's tactical approach to the Woodbury conflict has achieved every strategic objective he established when the war began: elimination of external threats, preservation of community security, and demonstration that his leadership can protect his people against any enemy willing to challenge their regional dominance. What the group is beginning to understand, though they haven't articulated it yet, is that Shane's victory against the governor has committed them to a permanent state of warfare against any other organized survivor group they encounter. Shane's leadership philosophy has eliminated coexistence as a strategic option, diplomacy as a conflict resolution method, and compromise as an acceptable outcome for disputes with external communities. They've become exactly the kind of militaristic survival community that other groups will need to destroy in order to ensure their own security. By day 352, the war is over, and Woodbury no longer exists. Shane's tactical brilliance has preserved every member of his community who survived the initial assault, secured resources that will sustain them for months, and eliminated the most significant external threat they've faced since establishing the prison settlement. Shane's approach to leadership has proven that authoritarian efficiency can achieve total victory when democratic alternatives might have resulted in compromise, negotiation, or coexistence. But total victory has come at costs that extend beyond the casualties and resources the war consumed. The prison community has become something that would be unrecognizable to the people who first established the settlement, a military organization whose primary purpose is eliminating threats rather than preserving human community. A fortress whose inhabitants have learned to treat other survivors as enemies rather than fellow human beings deserving of moral consideration. Shane's war against the governor has been won, but the victory has transformed his people into exactly the kind of threat that other communities will eventually need to eliminate to ensure their own survival. Chapter 9. Victory's Cost. There's a silence in the prison on day 353 that feels heavier than the sound of warfare that preceded it, a quiet that carries the weight of total victory and everything that victory has cost the people who achieved it. Shane Walsh stands in the guard tower overlooking the outer yard, surveying a facility that has been transformed by 3 weeks of systematic warfare into something that looks more like a military installation than a human community. The prison is secure, the external threat has been eliminated, resources have been acquired, and strategic objectives have been achieved. But the people who occupy these concrete walls and steel cells have been changed by the methods their survival required, and Shane's leadership philosophy has no framework for addressing what those changes mean for their long-term sustainability as a human community. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents the absence of someone who would have recognized that how you win a war determines what kind of people you become after the war is over. The bed that should have held someone capable of helping the community process the psychological costs of systematic violence. Someone who would have understood that victory without moral reflection creates communities that survive by becoming exactly the kind of threat they originally fought to eliminate. Instead, we have Shane, whose tactical training has taught him to treat post-conflict consolidation as a resource management problem rather than a humanitarian challenge requiring careful attention to individual psychological recovery and community moral rehabilitation. Shane's approach to post-war leadership reveals how completely his thinking has evolved beyond anything resembling democratic consideration of community members' emotional needs or moral concerns. Rather than gathering input from the group about how to process their experiences during the siege, or discussing the psychological impact of systematic warfare on people who never expected to become soldiers, Shane immediately begins implementation of enhanced security protocols designed to prevent any future external threats from challenging the prison's regional dominance. Guard rotations are increased, weapons training becomes mandatory for all community members, including children as young as Carl, resource allocation is restructured to prioritize military preparedness over individual comfort, and decision-making authority is further centralized under Shane's command structure to ensure rapid response to any potential threats. The prison community's organization becomes more militaristic in the aftermath of victory than it was during active warfare, reflecting Shane's understanding that their reputation for ruthless effectiveness will attract challenges from other survivor groups seeking to test or eliminate what they perceive as a regional threat. Here's what I find genuinely disturbing about Shane's post-war reorganization of the prison community. He doesn't recognize that his tactical success against the governor has created psychological problems that extend beyond military concerns. The people who fought in the siege carried trauma from weeks of systematic violence, guilt from killing other human beings, and moral confusion about whether their actions were justified by the results they achieved. But Shane's leadership philosophy has no mechanism for addressing individual psychological needs that don't directly contribute to community security, treating emotional processing as an operational luxury that effective leadership can't afford to prioritize. The integration of surviving Woodbury civilians into the prison community creates complications that Shane's tactical planning didn't anticipate. 17 people from Woodbury survived the final assault, including women, children, and elderly residents whose only crime was living in a community whose leader made strategic decisions that brought them into conflict with Shane's group. Shane's decision to accept these survivors into the prison reflects his understanding that additional personnel contribute to defensive capabilities, but their integration into the community creates moral and practical problems that his authoritarian leadership style struggles to address. The Woodbury survivors carry knowledge about the governor's methods, stories about life in a different kind of survival community, and questions about whether Shane's approach to leadership represents an improvement over the authoritarian system they've escaped. Their presence in the prison forces Shane's people to confront uncomfortable questions about the similarities between their own community structure and the Woodbury system they fought to destroy. Questions that Shane's leadership philosophy has eliminated from discussion, but that continue to influence individual community members' feelings about the kind of people they've become. Carol's interaction with Moria, a Woodbury mother whose husband was killed during Shane's final assault, reveals the psychological costs that Shane's tactical success has imposed on people who participated in achieving it. Carol attempts to offer comfort to a woman whose loss directly resulted from Carol's own actions during the siege, creating a moral complexity that Shane's operational framework provides no guidance for resolving. "I'm sorry about your husband," Carol tells Moria during one of their first conversations in the prison. "I know what it's like to lose someone." Maria's response carries the kind of moral clarity that Shane's people have learned to avoid. "You killed him. You were part of the attack that destroyed our town. How do you apologize for that?" Carol's inability to answer Maria's question reflects the broader moral confusion that Shane's leadership has created within his community. Carol participated in systematic warfare that achieved strategic objectives Shane defined as necessary for their survival, but her actions resulted in the deaths of people who posed no direct threat to her or to the people she was fighting to protect. Shane's tactical doctrine provided clear operational guidance for eliminating enemy combatants, but it provided no moral framework for processing the human costs of tactical success. Laurie Grimes's confrontation with Shane about his influence on Carl's psychological development occurs on day 358, when she observes her 12-year-old son practicing marksmanship with the clinical efficiency of someone who has learned to treat killing as a technical skill rather than a moral choice. Carl's transformation under Shane's training has made him an effective fighter whose combat capabilities contribute to community security. But Laurie recognizes that Carl's approach to violence reflects a fundamental alteration in his understanding of human value that extends beyond tactical necessity. "Shane, we need to talk about what you're doing to my son," Laurie says, approaching him in the guard tower where he's conducting his daily security assessment. Carl is 12 years old. He shouldn't be talking about killing people the way he talks about eliminating walkers. Shane's response reveals how completely his thinking has eliminated childhood innocence as a consideration relevant to survival planning. "Laurie, Carl is alive because he knows how to defend himself and his community. The world doesn't care how old he is. Walkers don't care, other survivors don't care, and pretending otherwise is going to get him killed." But Laurie's concern isn't about Carl's tactical training or his ability to defend himself in dangerous situations. Her concern is about the psychological and moral framework Shane has taught Carl to use when making decisions about violence against other human beings. Carl has learned to assess threats and eliminate them with mechanical efficiency, but he hasn't learned to wrestle with the moral implications of taking human life, or to maintain connection to the idea that individual lives have value beyond their tactical significance. I'm not talking about teaching him to defend himself, Laurie explains. I'm talking about teaching him that killing should be hard, that taking someone's life should matter, that he shouldn't be proud of how efficiently he can eliminate human beings. Shane's response to Laurie's moral concerns is characteristically pragmatic and final. Pride in tactical effectiveness keeps people alive, Laurie. Moral wrestling about necessary violence gets people killed. Carl is learning to survive in the world that actually exists, not the world you wish existed. The conversation ends with Laurie's recognition that Shane's influence on Carl's development represents something more than tactical education. Shane is teaching Carl to think about human life the way Shane thinks about human life, as a resource to be preserved when useful and eliminated when threatening. Carl's psychological development under Shane's guidance is producing exactly the kind of leader Shane's community will need to survive in the long term. Someone whose tactical effectiveness isn't compromised by moral complexity or humanitarian sentiment. Dale Horvath's death occurs on day 362, not from walker bite or enemy action, but from the accumulated stress of witnessing his community transform into something that contradicts everything he believed about human nature and moral responsibility. Dale's heart gives out during a night watch shift, his body finally succumbing to the psychological pressure of living in a community whose survival has been achieved through methods he spent months arguing against. Dale's final conversation with Carol, occurring the night before his death, reveals the depth of his moral despair about what the group has become under Shane's leadership. Carol, I don't think I understand what we're fighting to preserve anymore. We've survived. But have we preserved anything worth surviving for? Carol's response reflects the moral confusion that Shane's tactical success has created throughout the community. Dale, Shane kept us alive when other groups died. Shane got us through winter when we would have frozen. Shane beat the governor when the governor would have killed us all. How do I argue with results like that? You argue with results by asking whether the people who achieved those results are still the people you wanted to save, Dale says quietly. We've won, Carol. But look around. Look at what we've become to win. Dale's death represents the elimination of the last systematic voice of moral opposition to Shane's authoritarian methods, removing the final community member whose presence reminded others that survival might require different choices than the ones Shane consistently makes. Dale's funeral service is brief, tactical, focused on his contributions to community security rather than his moral influence or his unsuccessful attempts to preserve democratic values alongside defensive capabilities. Shane's eulogy for Dale reflects his understanding that Dale's death eliminates operational complications that arose from Dale's persistent moral criticism of tactical decisions. Dale was a good man who cared about doing right by people. Sometimes that caring made him question necessary decisions, but his heart was always with this community. The backhanded tribute reveals Shane's assessment that Dale's moral concerns were operational problems rather than valuable input about community direction. Shane recognizes Dale's good intentions while simultaneously categorizing Dale's moral criticism as evidence of thinking that couldn't adapt to post-outbreak survival realities. Dale's death allows Shane to consolidate authority that was never successfully challenged, but that was consistently questioned by someone whose moral standing made his criticism difficult to dismiss entirely. The group's debate about Shane's methods and their long-term costs occurs informally over the weeks following Dale's death, emerging in conversations between community members who are beginning to recognize that their tactical success has been achieved at moral and psychological costs they haven't systematically examined. Glenn raises questions about whether their reputation for ruthless effectiveness will eventually attract military challenges from larger, better organized survivor groups seeking to eliminate what they perceive as a regional threat to their own security. Maggie wonders whether the children growing up in Shane's community will retain any connection to ideas about human dignity and individual worth that extend beyond tactical utility. Herschel observes that their medical resources are increasingly directed toward treating combat injuries rather than addressing the psychological trauma that results from sustained participation in systematic warfare. Carroll notes that their food production has been subordinated to weapons manufacturing as the community's primary economic activity, but the debate about Shane's methods doesn't coalesce into organized resistance to his leadership because every criticism of Shane's approach must contend with the undeniable evidence of its effectiveness. The prison is secure, the community is well armed, resources are abundant, external threats have been eliminated, and everyone who survived the siege is alive because Shane made tactical decisions that prioritized their survival above competing moral considerations. Shane's leadership has delivered everything he promised when he first took command: security, sustainability, protection from external threats, and preservation of community members' lives. What Shane's leadership hasn't delivered, what his tactical philosophy has no framework for providing, is preservation of the moral and psychological qualities that make survival worthwhile rather than just possible. The prison community has become exactly what Shane's military training suggested would be necessary for long-term survival: a disciplined, effective, ruthless military organization capable of eliminating any threat to its continued existence. But it's also become exactly the kind of community that other survivor groups will eventually need to destroy in order to ensure their own security. New threats begin appearing on the horizon by day 370, as word of the prison group's reputation for systematic warfare spreads among other survivor communities in the region. Reports reach Shane through his intelligence networks about larger groups that are beginning to view the prison as a potential threat that might eventually need to be eliminated through preemptive military action. The prison's success in destroying Woodbury has established it as the dominant military force in the region. But dominance based on superior willingness to use lethal force creates enemies as efficiently as it eliminates threats. Shane's response to intelligence about potential future threats reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has committed the community to permanent warfare against any organized survivor group that might challenge their regional dominance. Rather than considering diplomatic outreach to establish peaceful coexistence with other communities, Shane begins preparation for additional military campaigns designed to eliminate potential threats before they can organize effective challenges to the prison's security. The empty hospital bed represents all the moral complexity that Shane's successful leadership has streamlined out of their survival strategy. Rick would have recognized that total victory, achieved through systematic warfare, creates more problems than it solves, that communities built on military efficiency attract military challenges, that preservation of human life requires attention to moral and psychological needs that extend beyond tactical security. Rick would have asked whether winning at the cost of becoming something monstrous was actually winning, or whether survival that required eliminating humanity was worth pursuing. But Rick isn't there. And Shane's methods continue to work exactly as his tactical training predicted they would work. The prison is the most secure survivor community in the region. Shane's people are the best armed and best trained fighters in Georgia, and their reputation for ruthless effectiveness ensures that potential enemies think carefully before challenging their dominance. Shane's leadership has created exactly the kind of community that can survive indefinitely in a world where survival depends on superior application of organized violence. What the group is beginning to understand, though they don't yet have the moral vocabulary to articulate it clearly, is that Shane's version of survival has transformed them into exactly the kind of threat that other communities will eventually need to eliminate. They've achieved security by becoming predators, preserved their lives by learning to take other lives efficiently, protected their children by teaching those children to think about human worth the way soldiers think about enemy combatants. Dale's death has removed the last voice capable of asking whether these transformations represent victory or defeat, leaving the community without anyone willing or able to provide moral guidance about what they're becoming in the name of staying alive. By day 371, the prison community has achieved everything Shane's leadership promised: complete security from external threats, abundant resources, military dominance over their region, and preservation of every community member who survived the initial establishment of their settlement. Shane's tactical approach to leadership has proven that authoritarian efficiency can create stable, secure, sustainable communities when democratic alternatives might have failed. But the people who occupy that secure community have been transformed by the methods their survival required into something that would be unrecognizable to the people who first sought shelter within these concrete walls. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. There's a meeting on day 377 that happens in the prison's lower cell block, away from the guard towers and away from Shane's surveillance network, that represents the first organized challenge to his authority since he consolidated power in the early days after the outbreak. Laurie Grimes sits at the center of a circle that includes Glenn, Maggie, Herschel, and 4 of the Woodbury survivors, their voices kept deliberately low as they discuss something that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier: the possibility that Shane's leadership has evolved beyond effective survival management into something that threatens everything they originally fought to preserve. The conversation they're having would cost them their place in the community if Shane discovered it. But the conversation has become necessary because Shane's methods have created a community that none of them recognize as worth preserving. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif again, but now it represents more than just Rick's absence from leadership decisions. It represents the absence of any systematic process for questioning authority, for challenging tactical decisions on moral grounds, for ensuring that survival doesn't come at the cost of everything that makes survival worthwhile. The bed that should have held someone who understood that democracy requires protected space for dissent, that communities need mechanisms for peaceful change of leadership, that effective governance includes ways of correcting course when methods produce unacceptable consequences. Laurie's attempt to establish democratic decision-making within the prison community reflects her growing recognition that Shane's authoritarian efficiency has eliminated everything she hoped to preserve about human civilization. The meeting she's organized isn't a conspiracy against Shane's leadership. It's an effort to create space for discussing whether the community's direction aligns with its members' values and whether alternative approaches to survival might preserve both security and humanity. "We need to talk about what we've become," Laurie begins, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who's spent weeks building courage for a conversation she knows is dangerous. Shane's methods work I'm not arguing with their effectiveness, but we need to ask ourselves whether surviving the way we've been surviving is worth the cost of becoming the kind of people we've become. Glenn's response reflects the moral confusion that Shane's tactical success has created throughout the community. Laurie, I understand what you're saying, but Shane kept us alive when the governor would have killed us. Shane got us through winter when other groups froze. How do we criticize results like that? But Herschel's perspective carries the weight of someone who's lived long enough to recognize patterns in how communities develop and change over time. Glenn, the question isn't whether Shane's methods work in the short term. The question is whether they create communities that can sustain themselves without becoming threats to everyone around them. Here's what I find genuinely significant about the democratic organizing that Laurie attempts to establish within Shane's community. She's not proposing to overthrow Shane's leadership or to eliminate tactical decision-making from crisis situations. She's proposing to create systematic input processes that would allow community members to participate in decisions about their community's direction, resource allocation, and moral boundaries. Laurie recognizes that Shane's expertise in crisis management shouldn't extend to absolute authority over every aspect of community life, and that effective survival requires attention to individual needs and values that Shane's tactical philosophy treats as operational luxuries. The meeting includes proposals for rotating leadership responsibilities, for establishing community councils that would provide input on resource allocation and conflict resolution, for creating protected processes that would allow community members to raise concerns about leadership decisions without fear of retaliation. Laurie's democratic organizing represents an attempt to preserve Shane's tactical effectiveness while constraining his authority within limits that would preserve space for individual autonomy and moral reflection. Shane's discovery of Laurie's democratic organizing occurs on day 378, when his surveillance network reports the meeting to him as potential security threat requiring immediate response. Shane's reaction to the challenge reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has evolved beyond anything resembling tolerance for systematic opposition to his authority. Rather than treating Laurie's concerns as legitimate input that might improve community decision-making, Shane immediately begins tactical assessment of the democratic organizing as potential sedition that threatens operational effectiveness and community security. Shane's response to the challenge is swift, decisive, and designed to eliminate democratic organizing as an option for expressing dissent within the prison community. Rather than negotiating with Laurie about institutional changes that might address her concerns while preserving his tactical authority, Shane presents the democratic organizers with an ultimatum that clarifies exactly how he views challenges to his leadership. As evidence that some community members value their individual preferences above collective survival requirements. Laurie, Shane says, approaching her in the common area where other community members can witness the conversation. I understand you've been organizing meetings to discuss changes to how we run this place. That's fine. Democracy is a luxury we can afford now that we're secure. But here's how democracy works in the real world. Anyone who doesn't like how things work here is free to leave and establish their own community according to their own principles. Shane's framing of democratic participation as a choice between absolute acceptance of his authority or exile from the community reveals how completely his thinking has eliminated democratic input as legitimate criticism of leadership decisions. Shane doesn't recognize Laurie's organizing as evidence that his methods might need modification or that his authority might benefit from institutional constraints. He recognizes it as evidence that some community members lack the discipline necessary for effective survival and that removing those members would improve overall community cohesion under his leadership. Laurie's response to Shane's ultimatum reflects her recognition that Shane's offer of democracy actually represents elimination of democracy as a meaningful option for community governance. Shane, I'm not asking to leave. I'm asking for community members to have input in decisions that affect their lives. That's not the same as rejecting your leadership. But Shane's understanding of leadership has evolved to the point where any systematic constraint on his authority represents an unacceptable compromise of operational effectiveness. Laurie, input slows down decision-making. Consensus building creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. Individual preferences conflict with collective security requirements. I make the calls that keep people alive. That's all. The conversation ends with Shane's declaration that democratic organizing will be treated as seditious activity that threatens community security, and that anyone who continues participating in attempts to constrain his authority through institutional mechanisms will be required to leave the prison community. Shane's elimination of democratic participation as a legitimate form of community engagement represents the logical endpoint of his authoritarian evolution, the point where his leadership philosophy has become incompatible with any form of systematic input or accountability. Daryl Dixon faces the most difficult choice of his life in the aftermath of Shane's ultimatum to the Democratic organizers. Daryl's loyalty to Shane has been based on respect for Shane's tactical effectiveness and his commitment to keeping the community alive. But Shane's response to Laurie's organizing forces Daryl to choose between that loyalty and his growing relationships with community members whose concerns about Shane's methods deserve consideration rather than dismissal. Daryl's conversation with Carol on day 380 reveals the depth of his moral conflict about Shane's leadership and his own role in supporting methods he's no longer sure he can defend. Carol's transformation under Shane's influence has made her an effective fighter, but it's also eliminated the gentle compassion that originally made Daryl feel protective toward her after Ed's death and Sophia's loss. Carol, do you ever think about who you were before? Daryl asks during one of their guard shifts, his tone carrying the careful uncertainty of someone probing for feelings he's not sure still exist. Carol's response reflects how completely Shane's training has altered her psychological framework for processing individual emotions and moral concerns. Before what, Daryl? Before I learned to defend myself. Before I learned to contribute to community security. Before I learned to prioritize collective survival over individual sentiment. Daryl recognizes the language of Shane's tactical philosophy in Carol's response, the clinical terminology that Shane uses to frame emotional processing as operational inefficiency. Carol hasn't just learned to fight effectively under Shane's training, she's learned to think about human relationships the way Shane thinks about human relationships, as resources to be managed according to their contribution to collective tactical objectives. But what disturbs Daryl most about Carol's transformation isn't her effectiveness as a fighter. It's the elimination of the emotional complexity that originally made her worth protecting. Carol has become exactly the kind of community member that Shane's leadership philosophy produces: competent, reliable, disciplined, and emotionally detached from anything that might interfere with operational requirements. Carol's survival under Shane's leadership has come at the cost of everything that originally made her survival worthwhile. Carl Grimes's psychological development under Shane's influence reaches a disturbing milestone on day 382, when he volunteers to participate in a training exercise that involves interrogating one of the Woodbury survivors suspected of maintaining loyalty to his former community. Carl's willingness to use psychological pressure against a potential security threat reflects his complete adoption of Shane's worldview and his understanding that individual welfare is subordinate to collective security requirements. The interrogation occurs in one of the prison's isolated cells, with Carl serving as Shane's assistant in extracting information about potential threats from other Woodbury survivors who might still be in the region. Carl's role involves creating psychological pressure through demonstrations of the community's willingness to use violence against people who threaten their security, a task that Carl approaches with the mechanical efficiency Shane has taught him to apply to all tactical requirements. "Tell us about the other camps," Shane instructs the Woodbury prisoner, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who has plenty of time to achieve his objectives. "Tell us about other groups that might view us as a threat." When the prisoner hesitates, Carl's response demonstrates how completely he's internalized Shane's approach to extracting tactical intelligence. Without instruction or hesitation, Carl draws his sidearm and places it against the prisoner's temple, his expression showing no recognition that he's threatening to kill a man whose only crime is reluctance to betray people he used to live with. "He asked you a question?" Carl says calmly, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that comes from someone who's learned to treat threats of violence as ordinary tools of communication. Carl's willingness to threaten execution to extract information represents the logical endpoint of his psychological development under Shane's guidance. At 12 years old, Carl operates as an effective interrogator, whose tactical skills include threatening to kill unarmed prisoners if their cooperation doesn't meet operational requirements. Carl's transformation under Shane's influence has produced exactly the kind of leader the prison community will need to maintain its regional dominance, someone whose tactical effectiveness isn't compromised by moral complexity or humanitarian sentiment. The prison community's division into competing factions becomes official on day 384, when Shane's ultimatum forces community members to choose between accepting his authority without institutional constraints or leaving the prison to establish alternative approaches to survival. The division reveals that Shane's tactical success has created a community whose members hold fundamentally incompatible views about what survival should preserve and what methods are justified by security requirements. The faction that remains loyal to Shane includes Daryl, Carol, Carl, and most of the community members whose survival has depended most directly on Shane's tactical protection. These community members recognize Shane's methods as harsh but effective, and they prioritize the security that Shane's leadership provides over the democratic values that democratic organizing might preserve. For Shane's supporters, the choice between survival and democracy represents an obvious tactical decision. Survival requirements supersede institutional preferences, and anyone who disagrees is welcome to test their democratic ideals against the realities of post-outbreak resource competition. The faction that supports democratic organizing includes Laurie, Glenn, Maggie, Herschel, and several Woodbury survivors whose experience living under the governor's authority has taught them to recognize the warning signs of authoritarianism becoming entrenched beyond institutional accountability. These community members don't dispute Shane's tactical effectiveness, but they argue that tactical effectiveness without institutional constraints eventually produces communities that survive by becoming threats to everyone around them. The Walker breach that tests the fractured community's ability to function under pressure occurs on day 386, when a section of the outer fence fails and allows approximately 40 walkers to penetrate the prison's defensive perimeter. The crisis requires immediate coordinated response from both factions within the community, creating the first test of whether Shane's tactical leadership can maintain operational effectiveness when community members' loyalty has been compromised by fundamental disagreements about governance and moral boundaries. Shane's response to the Walker breach reveals both the strengths and the limitations of his leadership philosophy when applied to a community whose unity has been fractured by internal conflict. Shane's tactical coordination during the crisis is flawless. His operational decisions are efficient and effective, and his leadership ensures that the Walker threat is eliminated with minimal casualties. But Shane's approach to coordinating the crisis response treats community members as tactical assets rather than individuals whose recent conflicts might affect their willingness to risk their lives for collective security. The crisis resolution succeeds because Shane's tactical expertise compensates for the community division that his leadership methods created, but it also reveals that the prison community's security depends entirely on Shane's personal effectiveness rather than institutional resilience. When Shane coordinates the response to the Walker breach, the community functions as an effective military unit. When Shane isn't directly managing operations, communication breaks down between factions, resource allocation becomes confused, and individual community members prioritize factional loyalty over collective security. The final confrontation about Shane's leadership and the community's future direction occurs in the immediate aftermath of the Walker breach, when both factions recognize that their current arrangement is unsustainable for long-term community security. The confrontation isn't about Shane's tactical effectiveness, which the crisis has demonstrated once again. It's about whether tactical effectiveness, without institutional accountability, can create communities that preserve anything worth surviving for. Laurie's challenge to Shane is direct and final. Shane, your methods work when you're in charge of everything. But what happens when you're not available? What happens when you make a mistake? What happens when your judgment fails? We need systems that can function without depending entirely on one person's tactical expertise. Shane's response reveals how completely his thinking has eliminated institutional accountability as a relevant consideration for effective leadership. Laurie, systems slow down decision-making. Accountability creates vulnerabilities. Institutional processes compromise operational security. I keep people alive. That's the only accountability that matters in this world. The confrontation ends with Laurie's recognition that Shane's leadership philosophy has evolved beyond anything that might be compatible with democratic governance or institutional constraints. Shane has become exactly the kind of leader his tactical training suggested the post-outbreak world would require. Someone whose authority is absolute, whose decision-making is unconstrained by democratic input, and whose effectiveness depends on elimination of systematic accountability as an operational luxury the community can't afford. The empty hospital bed represents all the democratic values that Shane's effective leadership has eliminated as incompatible with survival requirements. Rick would have recognized that communities need institutional mechanisms for questioning authority, for correcting course when leadership methods produce unacceptable consequences, for ensuring that survival doesn't come at the cost of everything that makes communities worth preserving. Rick would have insisted that tactical effectiveness, without institutional accountability, eventually produces leaders who become threats to the people they're supposed to protect. But Rick isn't there, and Shane's methods continue to work exactly as his tactical training predicted they would work. The prison community emerges from its internal crisis more unified under Shane's authority, more disciplined in its response to external threats, and more effective in its elimination of challenges to Shane's regional dominance. Shane's leadership has proven that authoritarian efficiency can maintain community security when democratic alternatives might have failed under pressure. By day 390, the internal reckoning has concluded with Shane's authority stronger than ever, and democratic organizing eliminated as a legitimate form of community engagement. The faction that supported institutional constraints on Shane's leadership has either accepted his authority without reservation or left the prison to establish alternative approaches to survival that will almost certainly fail when tested against the resource competition and military challenges that regional dominance requires. Shane's final victory over democratic organizing within his community represents the logical conclusion of his leadership evolution. The point where tactical effectiveness has become so essential to community survival that institutional accountability becomes impossible to maintain without compromising security. The prison community has become exactly what Shane's military training suggested would be necessary for long-term survival. A disciplined military organization whose effectiveness depends on absolute authority rather than democratic participation. What the community has lost in the process, what the empty hospital bed continues to represent, is any systematic mechanism for ensuring that their survival preserves anything worth surviving for. They've achieved security by becoming exactly the kind of threat that other communities will eventually need to eliminate. Effectiveness by adopting methods that ensure perpetual conflict with anyone who refuses to submit to their regional dominance. Shane's leadership has won every tactical challenge it has faced, but it has won by transforming his people into something that Rick would have struggled to recognize as worth preserving. Chapter 11. New Paths. There's a moment on day 400 when the prison gates open for the last time as a unified community, and two distinct groups of survivors prepare to test their competing visions of what survival should preserve in a world where staying alive has become the only shared value anyone can agree upon. Laurie Grimes stands beside a converted school bus that will carry her faction away from the concrete walls and steel bars that have defined their security for months, while Shane Walsh watches from the guard tower with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a tactical decision whose outcome will either validate his leadership philosophy or eliminate a persistent source of operational interference. The division that occurs today isn't just about leadership styles or resource allocation methods. It's about whether human communities can maintain connection to democratic values while ensuring physical security, and whether survival strategies that prioritize tactical effectiveness above all other considerations create long-term sustainability, or just postpone inevitable collapse. The empty hospital bed emerges as our motif one final time, but now it represents the divergence itself, two paths branching away from the single approach that Rick's presence might have synthesized into something that preserved both security and humanity. The bed that should have held someone capable of finding middle ground between Shane's tactical efficiency and Laurie's democratic idealism. Someone who could have created survival strategies that didn't require choosing between physical security and moral preservation. Instead, we have a clean break between incompatible worldviews, each group committed to proving that their approach to post-outbreak survival represents the only viable path forward. Shane's retention of the prison facility with 17 supporters reflects his tactical assessment that defensive advantages outweigh the personnel losses that the community division has created. Shane's faction includes Daryl, Carol, Carl, and most of the community members whose survival has depended most directly on Shane's military protection. These supporters recognize that Shane's harsh methods have kept them alive when democratic approaches might have failed under pressure, and they prioritize the security that Shane's leadership provides over the institutional accountability that Laurie's organizing attempted to establish. The composition of Shane's remaining group reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has succeeded in creating exactly the kind of community members it requires for long-term effectiveness. Darrell has evolved into Shane's perfect lieutenant, someone whose tactical skills and personal loyalty make him invaluable for military operations, while his moral reservations have been subordinated to operational requirements. Carol has become the ideal soldier, someone whose grief and trauma have been channeled into mechanical efficiency at eliminating threats to community security. Carl represents the future that Shane's methods produce, a child whose tactical training has eliminated moral complexity as a factor in decision-making about violence. Laurie's departure from the prison with 11 followers represents her attempt to establish a survival community that preserves democratic participation, individual autonomy, and humanitarian considerations alongside defensive capabilities. Laurie's faction includes Glenn, Maggie, Herschel, and several Woodbury survivors, whose experience living under authoritarian leadership has taught them to recognize the costs of subordinating individual welfare to collective security requirements. These community members don't dispute Shane's tactical effectiveness, but they believe that survival strategies that eliminate democratic values eventually produce communities that aren't worth preserving. Here's what I find genuinely significant about the community division that occurs on Day 400. Neither group is attempting to establish survival strategies that ignore security requirements or pretend that post-outbreak survival doesn't require difficult choices about resource allocation and threat elimination. Both Shane's military community and Laurie's democratic experiment recognize that physical security represents a necessary foundation for any sustainable approach to long-term survival. The division occurs because the two groups have reached fundamentally incompatible conclusions about whether tactical effectiveness requires elimination of democratic participation and whether community security justifies subordination of individual autonomy to collective survival requirements. Shane's immediate response to the community division reveals how completely his leadership philosophy has eliminated sentiment or personal attachment as factors that might compromise tactical decision-making. When Laurie's group prepares to leave the prison, Shane's operational assessment focuses on the security implications of personnel reduction rather than the personal relationships that the division will fracture. Shane calculates that losing 11 community members will reduce defensive capabilities, but eliminate internal opposition to tactical decisions, creating a net improvement in operational effectiveness. 17 people can hold this facility indefinitely against external threats, Shane tells his remaining supporters during their first organizational meeting after the division. 11 people weren't contributing enough tactical value to justify the operational complications their presence created. Shane's clinical assessment of the personnel reduction reflects his understanding that community effectiveness depends on ideological unity rather than numerical strength. Shane's remaining supporters share his commitment to prioritizing tactical effectiveness above competing considerations, eliminating the internal debate and moral hesitation that democratic organizing had introduced into operational planning. Shane's reduced community will function as a more efficient military unit because it no longer includes members whose humanitarian concerns might slow down decision-making during crisis situations. Laurie's establishment of an alternative survival community begins with her group's relocation to an abandoned elementary school about 40 miles from the prison, a facility that provides basic shelter while allowing them to test democratic approaches to resource allocation, conflict resolution, and defensive planning. Laurie's choice of location reflects her understanding that her community's survival will depend on proving that democratic participation can coexist with tactical effectiveness, that individual autonomy can be preserved alongside collective security, that humanitarian considerations can be maintained without compromising defensive capabilities. The elementary school offers advantages and disadvantages that mirror the fundamental challenge Laurie's community faces in establishing viable alternatives to Shane's authoritarian efficiency. The facility provides adequate shelter and defensible positions, but it lacks the concrete walls and steel doors that made the prison nearly impregnable against external threats. The school's classroom structure facilitates democratic meeting spaces and collaborative decision-making processes, but it also creates security vulnerabilities that Shane's tactical training would have eliminated through more militaristic organizational approaches. Laurie's first community meeting in the school's converted gymnasium reveals both the potential and the limitations of democratic organizing in post-outbreak survival situations. The meeting includes systematic discussion of resource allocation priorities, defensive strategy development, and conflict resolution procedures, allowing community members to participate in decisions that affect their daily lives and long-term survival prospects. But the meeting also requires 3 hours to reach consensus on decisions that Shane would have made in 3 minutes, demonstrating the operational costs of democratic participation in situations where rapid response capabilities might determine survival outcomes. Glen Rhee's struggle with divided loyalties between the two communities reflects the broader moral complexity that the division has created for community members whose relationships extend across ideological boundaries. Glen's romantic partnership with Maggie commits him to Laurie's democratic community, but his friendship with Daryl and his respect for Shane's tactical effectiveness create emotional connections to the prison group that democratic organizing can't replace. Glen recognizes that both survival approaches have legitimate advantages, and that the division forces artificial choices between tactical effectiveness and democratic values that might have been preserved simultaneously under different leadership. Glen's role as informal liaison between the two communities reveals how external pressures create situations where ideological divisions must be subordinated to collective survival requirements. When Glen's supply runs take him near the prison facility, he maintains communication with Daryl about regional security threats, sharing intelligence about other survivor groups whose activities might threaten both communities. Glen's liaison function demonstrates that practical cooperation can occur between ideologically divided communities when external threats create shared security interests that supersede internal disagreements about leadership philosophy. But Glen's divided loyalties also reveal the psychological costs of community division for individuals whose personal relationships have been fractured by competing survival philosophies. Glen's conversation with Maggie on day 405 demonstrates how the ideological split has created emotional complications that extend beyond tactical considerations. "Maggie, I believe in what we're doing here," Glen says during one of their evening conversations in the school's converted dormitory space. "I believe democratic participation is worth preserving, but I also know that Shane's methods work, and I worry about what happens if we encounter threats that require his kind of tactical response." Maggie's response reflects her recognition that community division has created security vulnerabilities that democratic organizing might not be able to address effectively. "Glen, Shane's methods work for Shane's kind of community. We're trying to build something different. Maybe we'll face threats that require different solutions than the ones Shane would choose." The conversation reveals the fundamental uncertainty that both communities face about whether their chosen survival approaches can maintain effectiveness when tested against the resource competition and military challenges that post-outbreak survival requires. Both groups are conducting experiments in survival philosophy, whose success or failure will be determined by their ability to maintain security while preserving the values they've chosen to prioritize. Carl Grimes' choice between his mother's democratic community and Shane's military protection occurs on day 408, when Laurie makes a direct appeal for Carl to join her group at the elementary school. Carl's decision represents the most personal test of the competing survival philosophies, forcing him to choose between family loyalty and tactical security, between democratic values that his mother considers essential and military effectiveness that Shane has proven through repeated success. Carl's conversation with Laurie reveals how completely Shane's training has altered his psychological framework for evaluating survival decisions. When Laurie explains that she wants Carl to grow up in a community that preserves individual autonomy and democratic participation, Carl's response demonstrates that he no longer recognizes these values as relevant to survival planning. "Mum, Shane taught me to defend myself and my community," Carl explains, his tone carrying the patient confidence of someone who's learned to prioritize tactical considerations above sentimental attachments. "Your community can't protect itself the way Shane's community can protect itself. I want to survive." Carl's choice to remain with Shane rather than joining Laurie's democratic experiment reflects his understanding that survival in the post-outbreak world requires tactical effectiveness that Shane's military training provides more reliably than democratic organizing can guarantee. Carl's decision is based on rational assessment of defensive capabilities rather than emotional loyalty to family relationships, demonstrating how completely Shane's leadership philosophy has succeeded in teaching Carl to prioritize collective security requirements above individual emotional needs. But Carl's choice also represents the broader generational impact of Shane's leadership approach, the way authoritarian survival strategies shape children's understanding of human relationships and community values. Carl has learned to think about community membership as a tactical decision rather than a moral or emotional choice, evaluating Laurie's parental authority against Shane's military effectiveness according to criteria that prioritize survival outcomes above family bonds. The external pressures that force both communities to reconsider their positions emerge on day 415, when intelligence reports indicate that a large survivor group called the Saviors has established territorial control over the region south of both communities and appears to be expanding northward through systematic conquest of smaller survivor settlements. The Saviors represent the kind of external threat that neither Shane's military community nor Laurie's democratic experiment can address effectively through isolated action, creating pressure for cooperation between ideologically divided groups whose survival may depend on collaborative response to shared threats. Shane's tactical assessment of the Savior threat reveals both the strengths and the limitations of his military approach to regional security. Shane's community possesses superior defensive capabilities and combat effectiveness, but it lacks the numerical strength and resource base necessary for sustained military operations against a larger, better organized enemy force. Shane recognizes that his community's survival might require temporary alliance with Laurie's group, creating operational complications that his leadership philosophy has no framework for managing. Laurie's democratic community faces even greater challenges in responding to the Savior threat, lacking both the defensive infrastructure and the tactical expertise necessary for effective military resistance against organized conquest. Laurie's community has succeeded in preserving democratic participation and individual autonomy, but these achievements become tactically irrelevant when faced with external enemies, whose survival strategy involves elimination of competing communities through superior application of organized violence. The intelligence about the Saviors forces both communities to confront fundamental questions about whether their chosen survival approaches can maintain effectiveness when tested against external threats that require responses beyond their individual capabilities. Shane's military efficiency has proven effective against threats that his community can eliminate through tactical superiority. But the saviors represent a challenge that might require resources and personnel that exceed Shane's current capabilities. Laurie's democratic organizing has succeeded in preserving humanitarian values, but those values become meaningless if her community lacks the defensive capability necessary for physical survival. Glenn's proposal for temporary military alliance between the two communities represents an attempt to synthesize Shane's tactical effectiveness with Laurie's democratic participation, creating collaborative response capabilities that neither group can achieve independently. Glenn's diplomatic initiative suggests that external pressures might force ideological cooperation that internal community development couldn't achieve, demonstrating how survival requirements can create bridges between competing survival philosophies when isolation becomes tactically unsustainable. But Glenn's diplomatic efforts also reveal the institutional barriers that ideological division has created between communities, whose survival strategies prioritize incompatible values. Shane's willingness to consider temporary alliance is based on tactical assessment of resource requirements rather than recognition of democratic organizing as legitimate governance, while Laurie's openness to military cooperation reflects emergency necessity rather than acceptance of authoritarian methods as permanently valid approaches to community leadership. The empty hospital bed represents all the synthesis possibilities that Rick's leadership might have preserved between Shane's tactical effectiveness and Laurie's democratic idealism. Rick would have recognized that both approaches to survival contained essential elements that sustainable communities require, that tactical security and democratic participation could be balanced rather than treated as mutually exclusive alternatives, that community division weakens both groups more than ideological compromise would weaken either approach. But Rick isn't there, and both communities must prove their chosen survival philosophies through practical testing against resource challenges and military threats that don't recognize ideological distinctions. Shane's military community has achieved tactical dominance within its defensive perimeter, but it faces isolation and personnel limitations that reduce its long-term sustainability. Laurie's democratic community has preserved humanitarian values and collaborative decision-making, but it lacks the defensive capabilities necessary for survival against organized external threats. The external pressure from the saviors creates the first test of whether either community has developed survival strategies that can maintain effectiveness beyond the controlled conditions that allowed their initial establishment. Both groups must demonstrate that their chosen approaches to leadership, resource allocation, and community organization can adapt to challenges that exceed their current capabilities, while preserving the values they've prioritized throughout their development. By day 420, both communities face decisions about cooperation, adaptation, and compromise that will determine whether their competing survival philosophies can evolve beyond ideological purity toward practical synthesis that preserves essential elements from both approaches. The division that seemed necessary on day 400 may prove unsustainable when tested against external threats that require capabilities neither community can provide independently, forcing recognition that survival in the post-outbreak world might require exactly the kind of balanced approach that Rick's presence might have made possible. Chapter 12. What remains? There's a stillness on day 500 that carries the weight of choices made and paths taken, a quiet that stretches across the Georgia landscape, where two very different communities have spent the last 80 days learning what their competing survival philosophies actually cost when measured against the relentless arithmetic of staying alive in a world that offers no redemption for tactical mistakes or moral failures. Shane Walsh stands in the prison's highest guard tower, surveying a facility that has evolved into something that looks more like a medieval fortress than anything resembling human community. While 40 miles away, Laurie Grimes tends a small garden outside the elementary school that has become home to people who chose preservation of democratic values over preservation of life, and who are beginning to understand that the distinction between those two goals may have been the most dangerous illusion they ever entertained. The empty hospital bed appears one final time in our story, but now it represents the full weight of what Rick Grimes's absence has cost not just these communities, but everyone whose survival has been shaped by leadership philosophies that developed without his moral influence. The bed that held Rick's unconscious body for weeks while the world ended around him has become a symbol of every choice that might have been different, every compromise that might have preserved both security and humanity, every synthesis that could have prevented the binary thinking that forced people to choose between tactical effectiveness and democratic participation as if those were mutually exclusive requirements for sustainable survival. Shane's prison community has achieved exactly what his military training suggested would be necessary for long-term regional dominance: absolute security within defensible perimeters, tactical superiority over any potential threats, and organizational efficiency that eliminates democratic input as operational interference. The prison houses 23 people who operate with the disciplined precision of a special forces unit, their daily routines structured around maintaining defensive capabilities, conducting intelligence, gathering about regional threats, and preparing for military operations against any survivor group whose presence might challenge their territorial control. But the tactical success that Shane's leadership has achieved has come at costs that extend beyond the moral compromises that Dale once worried about and that Laurie attempted to address through democratic organizing. Shane's community has become something that would be unrecognizable to the people who first sought shelter within these concrete walls. A military installation whose inhabitants have learned to think about human relationships as tactical assets, individual autonomy as operational liability, and survival as a zero-sum competition that requires elimination of anyone unwilling to submit to their regional authority. Daryl Dixon's evolution into Shane's perfect second-in-command has been completed through months of tactical operations that reinforced his loyalty to Shane's methods while systematically eliminating his capacity for moral reflection about what those methods require. Daryl functions as an extension of Shane's operational philosophy, conducting reconnaissance missions, coordinating defensive operations, and training new community members according to tactical doctrines that prioritize effectiveness above every other consideration. Daryl's transformation represents the logical endpoint of Shane's approach to human development. Individuals whose skills serve collective security requirements without emotional complications that might interfere with operational necessity. Carol Pelletier has become Shane's most effective trainer for converting new community members into disciplined soldiers whose personal histories are subordinated to tactical effectiveness. Carol's own journey from grieving mother to mechanical killer has provided her with expertise in helping others complete the psychological transitions that Shane's community requires for long-term sustainability. Carol teaches new arrivals to channelize personal trauma into combat effectiveness, to process loss as motivation for eliminating external threats, and to understand individual emotional needs as luxuries that effective survival can't afford to indulge. But perhaps the most revealing development in Shane's community is Carl Grimes's emergence as a leader whose tactical skills and moral framework represent the pure distillation of Shane's survival philosophy applied to someone who never experienced democratic governance or humanitarian consideration as viable alternatives to authoritarian efficiency. At 13, Carl operates as Shane's strategic planner, intelligence analyst, and field commander, his tactical decisions uncomplicated by nostalgia for pre-outbreak social values or guilt about the human costs that effective military operations require. Carl's development under Shane's guidance has produced exactly the kind of leader the post-outbreak world seemed to require. Someone whose tactical judgment isn't compromised by moral complexity, whose operational decisions prioritize collective security above individual welfare, and whose authority derives from demonstrated effectiveness rather than democratic consent. Carl represents Shane's victory over the humanitarian impulses that might have preserved individual conscience alongside tactical capability, the successful creation of leadership that functions without the moral wrestling that Rick would have brought to impossible choices. Here's what I find genuinely unsettling about Carl's evolution under Shane's influence. It works. Carl's decisions keep people alive, his tactical assessments prove accurate under pressure, and his leadership inspires the kind of disciplined loyalty that effective military units require for sustained operations. Carl has become exactly what Shane's training was designed to produce, and the results validate Shane's belief that survival in the post-outbreak world requires leaders whose effectiveness isn't compromised by humanitarian sentiment or democratic accountability. Laurie's community at the elementary school has achieved something entirely different. Preservation of democratic participation, individual autonomy, and collaborative decision-making alongside defensive capabilities that have proven adequate for survival against the threats they've encountered during their 80 days of independent operation. The school houses 14 people who maintain the kind of interpersonal relationships and institutional accountability that Shane's tactical philosophy eliminated as operational complications, but whose survival has required constant adaptation and compromise that tests whether democratic values can coexist with the resource competition that post-outbreak survival requires. Glenn Rhee's role in Laurie's community has evolved into something approaching Rick's original approach to leadership, collaborative decision-making that includes systematic input from community members while maintaining operational effectiveness during crisis situations. Glenn's tactical skills have improved through necessity and experience, but his approach to leadership preserves space for individual autonomy and moral reflection that Shane's military efficiency eliminates as operational luxuries. Glenn represents Laurie's attempt to prove that survival doesn't require elimination of democratic values, that tactical effectiveness can coexist with humanitarian consideration. But Glenn's leadership also reveals the fundamental challenges that democratic organizing faces in post-outbreak survival situations. Community meetings require hours to reach decisions that military command structures make in minutes. Consensus building creates operational delays that can prove fatal during crisis situations, and individual autonomy sometimes conflicts with collective security requirements in ways that threaten community survival. Glenn's democratic approach to leadership has kept Laurie's community together and preserved their commitment to humanitarian values, but it has also created vulnerabilities that military-style organization would eliminate through authoritarian efficiency. Maggie Green's role in Laurie's community has focused on maintaining agricultural production and medical capabilities that provide sustainable resource base for long-term survival without requiring the kind of aggressive resource acquisition that Shane's community employs through raiding and territorial conquest. Maggie's expertise has allowed Laurie's community to achieve self-sufficiency in food production and basic medical care, demonstrating that collaborative approaches to survival can create sustainable resource strategies that don't depend on military dominance over regional competitors. But Maggie's agricultural success has also revealed the limitations of peaceful survival strategies when faced with external threats that prioritize military conquest over collaborative resource sharing. Laurie's community has achieved sustainability within their controlled territory, but they lack the tactical capability necessary for defending their achievements against organized military threats that view their resources as legitimate targets for acquisition through superior application of violence. The major external threat that forces both communities to confront the limitations of their chosen survival approaches emerges on day 485, when intelligence reports confirm that the Saviors have begun systematic conquest of survivor communities throughout the region, employing overwhelming military force to eliminate resistance and incorporate useful resources and personnel into their expanding territorial control. The Saviors represent exactly the kind of organized military threat that neither Shane's fortress community nor Laurie's democratic experiment can address effectively through isolated action, creating pressure for collaboration between ideologically divided groups whose survival requires capabilities that neither approach has developed independently. Shane's tactical assessment of the Savior threat reveals both the strengths and the limitations of his military approach to regional security when faced with enemies whose resource base and organizational capabilities exceed his community's defensive advantages. Shane's intelligence gathering indicates that the Saviors command approximately 200 fighters organized into coordinated assault teams with vehicle-mounted weapons and ammunition reserves that would overwhelm the prison's defensive positions through sustained siege operations. Shane recognizes that his community's survival requires alliance with other regional groups, but his leadership philosophy has eliminated diplomatic skills and collaborative frameworks that would make such alliances possible. Laurie's community faces even greater vulnerability against the Savior threat, lacking both the defensive infrastructure and the tactical expertise necessary for military resistance against organized conquest operations. Laurie's democratic organizing has succeeded in preserving humanitarian values and collaborative decision-making, but these achievements become irrelevant when faced with external enemies, whose survival strategy involves systematic elimination of competing communities through superior application of organized violence. Laurie recognizes that her community's survival may require temporary adoption of military methods that contradict the democratic principles they've fought to preserve. The forced cooperation between Shane's and Laurie's communities begins on day 490, when Glenn's diplomatic initiative creates temporary military alliance designed to pool defensive resources and tactical expertise for coordinated resistance against Savior expansion. The alliance represents an attempt to synthesize Shane's tactical effectiveness with Laurie's democratic participation, creating collaborative defense capabilities that neither community can achieve independently while preserving essential elements from both survival approaches. But the alliance also reveals how completely the community division has eliminated institutional frameworks for collaborative decision-making between groups whose leadership philosophies prioritize incompatible values. Shane approaches the alliance as tactical arrangement between his community and subordinate personnel who will contribute resources to operations under his strategic direction. Laurie approaches the alliance as partnership between equals whose collaboration will preserve both tactical effectiveness and democratic accountability. Neither approach recognizes the other's institutional assumptions as legitimate, creating operational conflicts that threaten the alliance's effectiveness even as external pressure makes the alliance necessary for survival. Carl's role in coordinating the inter-community alliance reveals how completely Shane's training has shaped his understanding of leadership, collaboration, and human relationships. Carl treats Laurie's community members as tactical assets, whose skills serve operational objectives determined by Shane's strategic planning, without recognition that these individuals might deserve input into decisions that affect their survival prospects. Carl's approach to alliance coordination works efficiently from a military standpoint, but it eliminates the collaborative elements that Laurie's community considers essential for legitimate governance. The discovery of Rick's fate occurs on day 498, when Glenn's reconnaissance mission to gather intelligence about savior movements takes him through King County and past the hospital where Rick's story should have begun. Glenn finds Rick's body in the same bed where he fell into his coma, preserved by the hospital's sealed environment and the absence of walker activity in sections of the building that were secured before the initial outbreak spread through the facility. Rick died peacefully in his sleep sometime during the first winter after the outbreak, his body showing no signs of violence or struggle, just the gradual failure of someone whose medical condition couldn't be sustained without active intervention. Glenn's discovery of Rick's body provides devastating confirmation that the path their communities have taken represents choices rather than inevitable consequences of survival necessity. Rick's peaceful death suggests that alternative approaches to leadership and community organization might have been possible, that the binary thinking that forced Shane's tactical efficiency and Laurie's democratic organizing into incompatible opposition might have been synthesized by someone whose moral authority could have preserved both security and humanity. The revelation about Rick's fate forces both communities to confront uncomfortable questions about what their survival has actually preserved and what it has cost them to achieve it. Shane's tactical success has kept more people alive than Rick's approach might have managed, but it has created a community whose members have been transformed into something that Rick wouldn't recognize as worth preserving. Laurie's democratic organizing has maintained humanitarian values that Rick would have supported, but it has created vulnerabilities that have cost lives and threatened the community's long-term sustainability. Carl's response to learning about his father's fate reveals how completely Shane's training has eliminated sentimental attachment as a factor in tactical decision-making. Carl processes the information about Rick's death as historical data that confirms the superiority of Shane's survival methods over alternative approaches that might have prioritized moral considerations above operational effectiveness. Carl doesn't experience grief for the father he never knew or regret about the path his life has taken under Shane's guidance, because Shane's training has taught him to evaluate outcomes according to survival results rather than emotional or moral criteria. But Carl's lack of emotional response to Rick's death also reveals the psychological costs of Shane's approach to human development, the way tactical training eliminates emotional complexity and moral reflection as operational complications that interfere with effective decision-making. Carl has become exactly what Shane's leadership philosophy was designed to produce, but his effectiveness has come at the cost of everything that might have preserved connection to the humanitarian values that Rick would have insisted were worth fighting for, alongside physical survival. The choice about whether to reunite or continue on separate paths confronts both communities in the aftermath of their temporary alliance against the Saviors, whose threat has been eliminated through coordinated military action that proved both the effectiveness and the limitations of their competing survival approaches. The alliance succeeded in achieving tactical objectives through superior application of organized violence, but it also revealed how completely their community division has eliminated institutional frameworks for sustainable collaboration that would preserve both security and democratic accountability. Shane's position on reunification reflects his understanding that tactical effectiveness requires ideological unity rather than democratic compromise that might slow down operational decision-making during future crisis situations. Shane recognizes that Laurie's community members could contribute valuable skills to expanded defensive operations, but only if they accept subordination to his command structure and elimination of democratic input as operational interference. Shane offers reunification on terms that would preserve his tactical authority while incorporating useful personnel from Laurie's community, but his offer requires abandonment of democratic organizing as the price of alliance. Laurie's position on reunification reflects her recognition that temporary cooperation proved both communities' survival requirements overlap significantly, but that permanent alliance would require institutional frameworks that preserve democratic accountability alongside tactical effectiveness. Laurie proposes reunification based on collaborative governance that would constrain Shane's tactical authority through systematic community input while preserving his expertise for crisis situations that require rapid operational response. Laurie's proposal attempts to synthesize Shane's effectiveness with democratic accountability, but it requires Shane to accept institutional limitations that his leadership philosophy has rejected as incompatible with survival necessity. The empty hospital bed transforms one final time in our story, representing not just Rick's absence from leadership decisions, but the full weight of what different approaches to survival preserve and what they cost when measured against the human communities they create. Rick's bed becomes a symbol of synthesis possibilities that were lost when leadership philosophy development occurred without moral influence that might have prevented binary thinking about tactical effectiveness and democratic values as mutually exclusive requirements for sustainable survival. The community's ultimate decision about reunification occurs on day 505, when both groups recognize that their survival in the post-outbreak world will continue to require capabilities that neither approach has developed independently, but that their ideological divisions have created institutional barriers that prevent sustainable collaboration even when tactical cooperation proves necessary for addressing external threats. Neither community chooses reunification because neither group has developed frameworks for preserving essential elements from competing survival philosophies while maintaining operational effectiveness. Instead, both communities choose to maintain separate paths while developing collaborative arrangements for addressing shared threats that require coordinated response capabilities. Shane's military community will continue providing tactical expertise and defensive support for regional security operations, while Laurie's democratic community will continue providing resource production and humanitarian services that support long-term sustainability for collaborative efforts. The arrangement preserves both communities' chosen approaches to governance while creating mechanisms for addressing survival challenges that require capabilities neither approach provides independently. But the separation also represents recognition that the kind of synthesis Rick might have achieved between tactical effectiveness and democratic accountability became impossible once leadership development occurred within frameworks that treated those approaches as incompatible rather than complementary requirements for sustainable human community. Shane and Laurie have created survival strategies that work within their chosen parameters, but they've also created communities whose institutional assumptions prevent the kind of collaborative governance that sustainable regional security might require for long-term effectiveness. What remains, at the end of all these choices and their consequences, is proof that survival in the post-outbreak world can be achieved through multiple approaches to leadership and community organization, but that each approach preserves certain human values while sacrificing others in ways that shape what kinds of people communities produce and what kinds of relationships those people can maintain with each other and with competing groups whose survival strategies prioritize different values. Shane's military community has achieved everything his tactical training suggested would be necessary for long-term regional dominance: absolute security, operational effectiveness, and elimination of internal opposition to leadership decisions. But Shane's community has also produced people whose approach to human relationships and moral decision-making would be unrecognizable to anyone who remembers democratic governance or humanitarian consideration as legitimate factors in community life. Laurie's democratic community has preserved everything she hoped to maintain about pre-outbreak social values: individual autonomy, collaborative decision-making, and humanitarian consideration for individual welfare alongside collective security requirements. But Laurie's community has also accepted vulnerabilities and resource limitations that threaten their long-term sustainability and create dependencies on tactical expertise they've chosen not to develop independently. The empty hospital bed, in its final transformation, represents not failure but recognition, the understanding that Rick's moral authority might have synthesized competing survival requirements into sustainable approaches that preserved both tactical effectiveness and democratic accountability, but that Rick's absence forced development of leadership philosophies that treated those requirements as mutually exclusive rather than complementary elements of sustainable human community. Both communities survive on day 500, but they survive by becoming different kinds of people than they would have become under Rick's influence, and they create different kinds of relationships with each other and with the post-outbreak world than Rick's synthesis might have made possible. What remains is proof that the question was never whether people could stay alive without Rick Grimes's moral leadership, but whether the people who stayed alive would preserve anything that Rick would have recognized as worth the cost of keeping them breathing. The answer, as the empty hospital bed settles into its final silence, depends entirely on what you believe survival should preserve and what you are willing to sacrifice to ensure it continues.